Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadowy corners of a Victorian medicine cabinet, where innocent-looking amber bottles hold secrets that could explain some of the most puzzling behaviour in 19th century history. You're running your fingers along dusty shelves, past tinctures of mercury and bottles of cocaine-laced tooth drops, when you discover something that changed everything. Laudanum. This sweet, dark liquid wasn't just medicine. It was the drug that turned respectable Victorian ladies into unpredictable, sometimes violent shadows of themselves. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why so many hysterical women ended up in asylums, or why Victorian literature is filled with references to strange, dreamlike states of mind. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. I'd love to know where and when you started watching this video, or perhaps you could share a compliment about what draws you to these historical mysteries. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're standing in your grandmother's attic on a rainy afternoon, sorting through decades of accumulated memories. The air smells of old wood and lavender sachets, and dust motes dance in the pale light filtering through a small window. Thunder rumbles softly in the distance, creating the perfect backdrop for discovery. Among the usual treasures, faded photographs, yellowed letters, and vintage clothing that carries the ghost scent of old perfume, you discover an ornate wooden box tucked behind a pile of hand-stitched quilts. Your fingers trace the intricate carving on its lid, feeling the smooth wood worn by countless hands before yours, before lifting it open with a satisfying creak that echoes through the quiet space. Inside, nestled in faded burgundy velvet that has lost its lustre over the decades, lies a collection of small glass bottles that seem to glow in the dim light. Each one bears an elegant label written in flowing Victorian script: Laudanum, for relief of pain and nervous disorders. The bottles are beautiful, with their amber glass catching what little light reaches this forgotten corner, and their cork stoppers sealed with wax that has cracked with age. You lift one carefully, feeling its surprising weight, and notice how the remaining liquid inside has turned nearly black with time, moving with an oily consistency that seems almost alive as it swirls against the glass. This innocent-looking medicine cabinet discovery represents one of history's most widespread and misunderstood drug epidemics, one that swept through Victorian society like an invisible plague. These weren't the bottles of a drug addict, at least not in the way we understand addiction today. They belonged to respectable Victorian women, your great-great-grandmother perhaps, who turned to laudanum as their prescribed salvation from the crushing weight of 19th century expectations. What you're holding represents a time when opium was as common in middle-class homes as aspirin is today, yet infinitely more dangerous and socially acceptable. The liquid inside these bottles contained enough opium to send a modern person into a dangerous stupor. But Victorian women sipped it with their morning tea, stirred it into their afternoon refreshments, and measured careful spoonfuls into their evening cocoa. They called it their medicine, their nerve tonic, their daily comfort, their lady's friend. What they didn't call it was what it actually was: liquid addiction that would transform thousands of proper ladies into unpredictable, sometimes frightening versions of themselves, creating scenes that would have been unthinkable in polite society. You set the bottle down gently on a nearby trunk, imagining the woman who once relied on its contents with religious devotion. Perhaps she started innocently enough, with just a few drops for a genuine ailment, the agonizing recovery from a difficult childbirth, chronic pain that doctors couldn't properly diagnose or treat, or the mysterious condition that medical professionals confidently labelled hysteria. The initial relief must have felt like divine intervention, a blessed escape from physical suffering that 19th century medicine struggled to address effectively. But laudanum had a seductive quality that whispered promises far beyond pain relief. It offered escape from the suffocating corsets that cinched waists to impossible measurements, from the endless social obligations that demanded constant performance of feminine perfection, and from the emotional restrictions that forbade women from expressing anger, frustration, or genuine desire. In those first euphoric moments after taking her prescribed dose, a Victorian woman could feel truly free, her mind floating above the constraints of proper society, her body released from its prison of expectations. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. What began as medicinal necessity evolved into psychological dependency, then into physical addiction that demanded increasing doses to achieve the same blessed relief. Women who'd never uttered an improper word in public began speaking their minds with startling honesty. Those who had maintained perfect posture and deportment started swaying like dancers to music only they could hear. The most shocking change was in their temperament. Gentle ladies who had never raised their voices suddenly erupted into fits of rage, or collapsed into uncontrollable sobbing that could last for hours. You notice other items in the box now, scattered around the bottles like artifacts of a secret life. There's a small silver spoon, tarnished black but clearly designed for measuring doses, a leather-bound journal with pages filled in shaking handwriting that becomes increasingly illegible toward the end of entries, several letters tied with a faded ribbon, their contents hinting at desperate correspondence with other women sharing similar struggles. Most telling is a small mirror, cracked down the middle, as if someone had thrown it in a moment of rage or despair. The evidence tells a story of gradual deterioration that families tried desperately to hide. Victorian society's emphasis on public respectability meant that a woman's increasing dependence on laudanum became a shameful family secret. Servants were sworn to silence about their mistress's episodes. Husbands made excuses for their wives' absence from social gatherings. Children learned to tiptoe around mother during her difficult days. The very medicine that promised to make women better wives and mothers was slowly destroying the foundation of Victorian domestic life. As you examine a prescription bottle more closely, you notice the physician's name embossed on the label, Dr. Nathaniel Pembroke, a name you might find in local historical records as a respected family doctor who probably prescribed laudanum to hundreds of women during his career. Like his colleagues across Britain and America, Dr. Pembroke likely believed he was providing compassionate care to suffering women. The tragic irony is that these well-meaning physicians had created an epidemic of addiction while thinking they were curing female weakness and moral failings. Historians still argue whether Victorian doctors were criminally negligent or simply ignorant about opium's addictive properties. But the evidence suggests a troubling combination of both. The medical community treated laudanum as a miracle cure, prescribing it with the confidence of modern doctors recommending vitamins for everything from teething babies to grieving widows. Without understanding they were creating a generation of dependent patients. The irony is particularly bitter when you consider that these same doctors often diagnosed the very symptoms of laudanum addiction: mood swings, erratic behaviour and nervous disorders, as signs of inherent female weakness requiring more medication. The bottles in your hands represent more than just medical history. They're evidence of a hidden epidemic that shaped an entire era's understanding of women, madness, and medicine, as you carefully return each bottle to its velvet nest. You can almost hear the whispered conversations between Victorian women, sharing their remedies and treatments in hushed tones, unaware that their salvation had become their curse. The rain continues to patter against the attic window, and you realise you're about to uncover a story that reveals the dark underbelly of an age remembered for its moral righteousness and social order. You hold these Victorian bottles while your mind travels backward through time, following the dark trail that brought opium from ancient fields to proper English drawing rooms. The journey of this deadly medicine begins thousands of years before your great-great-grandmother ever lifted that first amber bottle to her lips. In the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, where humanity first discovered the intoxicating power of the poppy flower, picture yourself walking through ancient Sumerian fields around 3400 BCE, where farmers noticed something peculiar about certain flowers growing wild among their crops. The opium poppy, with its delicate petals ranging from white to deep purple, seemed innocent enough until someone discovered that scoring the seed pod released a milky latex that dried into a powerful resin. These early civilizations called it the plant of joy, and clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia contain some of humanity's first written references to opium's ability to banish pain and sorrow. The ancient Egyptians elevated opium use to an art form, incorporating it into religious ceremonies and medical treatments. Egyptian physicians wrote detailed papyrus scrolls describing how to prepare opium for everything from calming crying infants to easing the passage of the dying. The Ebers Papyrus, dating from around 1550 BCE, contains over 700 medical formulas, many incorporating opium as a primary ingredient. Egyptian priests used opium during religious ceremonies to induce visions they believed connected them to the gods, while embalmers mixed it into the resins used for mummification, perhaps believing it would ease the deceased's journey to the afterlife. The drug spread through trade routes like honey, sweet and irresistible, moving from Egypt to Greece, where Hippocrates himself prescribed it for various ailments, though he warned against its potential for dependency, advice that would be tragically forgotten by Victorian doctors centuries later. Greek physicians called opium nepenthe, the same mythical drug that Helen of Troy used to banish sorrow in Homer's Odyssey. This literary connection established opium's reputation as a magical cure for emotional suffering, an idea that would persist well into the Victorian era. You can almost smell the exotic spices and feel the silk-laden breeze as you follow opium's path along the ancient trade routes. Arab merchants carried it across desert caravans to Asia, where Chinese alchemists transformed it into smoking preparations that would eventually devastate entire populations. The Arabs refined opium preparation techniques, creating more potent tinctures and developing the first standardized dosing methods. Islamic physicians like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote extensively about opium's medical applications while warning of its dangerous potential for creating dependency. But the Chinese also developed laudanum's earliest ancestor, liquid opium preparations mixed with wine or honey that were remarkably similar to what Victorian women would later sip with their afternoon tea. Chinese medical texts from the Tang dynasty describe elaborate opium-based remedies for everything from chronic pain to emotional distress, and archaeological evidence suggests that opium use was widespread among Chinese nobility by the 8th century CE. The truly pivotal moment in opium's journey to Victorian medicine cabinets came in 1527, when a Swiss physician named Paracelsus created what he called laudanum, from the Latin word laudare, meaning to praise. His formula combined opium with gold, pearls, coral, amber, and other precious substances, creating a medicine he claimed could resurrect the dead. While Paracelsus was clearly exaggerating, the man also believed he could create artificial humans in laboratory flasks. His laudanum did provide dramatic pain relief that seemed miraculous to 16th century patients, accustomed to crude surgical procedures without anesthesia. Paracelsus travelled throughout Europe demonstrating his miracle cure, performing dramatic public demonstrations where he would treat patients suffering from various ailments. His theatrical approach to medicine, combined with laudanum's undeniable effectiveness for pain relief, made him famous throughout European courts. Noble families began keeping supplies of laudanum for emergencies, establishing the precedent for opium's presence in wealthy households. Thomas Sydenham, an English physician known as the English Hippocrates, refined Paracelsus's formula in the 1660s, creating what became known as Sydenham's laudanum. His recipe was simpler but more potent. Opium dissolved in wine with saffron, cinnamon, and cloves for flavour. Sydenham famously declared that among the remedies which it has pleased Almighty God to give to man to relieve his sufferings, none is so universal and so efficacious as opium. This endorsement from such a respected physician gave laudanum the medical credibility it needed to spread throughout European society. Sydenham's influence cannot be overstated. His medical textbooks were used in European universities for over a century, ensuring that generations of physicians learned to prescribe opium-based remedies as first-line treatments. His detailed case studies described using laudanum for dozens of conditions, from plague symptoms to melancholy, establishing the broad medical applications that Victorian doctors would later expand even further. But the real explosion in opium availability came through Britain's aggressive pursuit of trade with China. You're now witnessing one of history's most shameful chapters, the Opium Wars of the mid-1800s. British merchants, particularly the East India Company, had grown frustrated with China's restrictions on foreign trade. The Chinese would only accept silver in exchange for their tea, silk, and porcelain, creating a massive trade imbalance that drained British coffers. The solution was as simple as it was morally bankrupt. Flood China with opium grown in British-controlled India. British merchants could trade Indian opium for Chinese goods, eliminating their silver shortage while creating millions of Chinese addicts. The East India Company established vast poppy plantations across Bengal and Bihar, employing thousands of Indian farmers in what amounted to industrial-scale drug production. British officials oversaw every step of the process, from planting to processing to shipping, creating a sophisticated narcotics operation that would make modern drug cartels envious. When the Chinese government tried to stop this devastating trade by destroying British opium shipments, Britain responded with military force, launching the First Opium War in 1839. You can picture British warships bombarding Chinese coastal cities, while British merchants continued shipping opium into China under military protection. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 forced China to pay massive reparations and open additional ports to British trade, ensuring a steady flow of opium profits. A Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860 further expanded British access to Chinese markets. Historians still argue whether the British government was primarily motivated by free trade principles or opium profits. But the result was clear. Britain became the world's largest opium dealer. The annual revenue from opium sales to China exceeded £6 million by the 1850s, roughly equivalent to hundreds of millions in today's currency. This massive income funded British colonial expansion, naval supremacy, and domestic infrastructure projects, making opium profits integral to Britain's imperial success. This massive opium trade infrastructure, built on the suffering of Chinese addicts, had an unexpected consequence for British society, with ships regularly arriving from India loaded with raw opium. British pharmaceutical companies could easily obtain the raw materials needed to mass-produce laudanum and other opium-based medicines. What had once been an expensive exotic drug became affordable enough for middle-class families to keep bottles in their medicine cabinets. The transformation of opium from exotic luxury to household staple happened with remarkable speed during the early Victorian era. Pharmaceutical companies like Allen and Hanbury's and Burroughs Wellcome began manufacturing standardized laudanum preparations, complete with elegant packaging and professional marketing that emphasized medical respectability. These weren't street drugs sold by shady dealers, they were legitimate medicines prescribed by respected physicians and sold by established chemists. As you trace this path from ancient Mesopotamian poppies to Victorian medicine cabinets, you begin to understand how a plant once reserved for religious ceremonies became the daily companion of respectable British housewives. The same imperial ambitions that brought tea and silk to British homes also ensured a steady supply of the opium that would transform thousands of Victorian women into the very maniacs their society feared. You step away from the ancient history of opium and find yourself transported into the suffocating world of a Victorian drawing room, where the very definition of feminine perfection was slowly crushing the women who were expected to embody it. The heavy velvet curtains block most of the sunlight, and the air feels thick with the weight of social expectations that press down on every respectable lady like an invisible corset around her entire existence. Picture yourself as a middle-class Victorian woman, waking each morning to face a day structured by rigid social rules that governed everything from how you walked to how you breathed. Your maid approaches with the day's first torture device, a corset designed to cinch your waist to an impossible 18 inches, regardless of your natural body shape. The steel boning digs into your ribs as she pulls the laces tighter and tighter, until breathing becomes a conscious effort and bending at the waist is nearly impossible. You feel your organs shifting to accommodate this daily compression, creating a constant ache in your lower back and ribs that will plague you throughout the day. Medical records from the period reveal that prolonged corseting actually displaced women's internal organs, causing chronic pain, digestive problems, and breathing difficulties that would mysteriously disappear when they loosened their stays. The liver could be pushed down several inches, the stomach compressed until it could hold only a fraction of a normal meal, and the lungs restricted until deep breathing became impossible. Victorian doctors, however, attributed these symptoms to feminine weakness rather than the obvious cause literally wrapped around their patients' torsos. The corset is just the beginning of your daily physical ordeal. Layer upon layer of clothing follows: chemise, drawers, stockings, petticoats, bustle, overskirt, bodice, gloves, and finally a hat secured with pins that dig into your scalp. By the time you're fully dressed, you're carrying nearly 20 pounds of fabric and accessories, and the weight distribution means that every step requires careful balance. Your movements must remain graceful despite this burden, because any sign of discomfort or awkwardness would be seen as evidence of poor breeding or weak character. The bustle alone presents unique challenges. Sitting becomes an exercise in careful positioning, and climbing stairs requires lifting layers of fabric while maintaining perfect posture. The weight of your elaborate hairstyle, secured with dozens of hairpins and often supplemented with false hairpieces, creates constant tension in your neck and shoulders. Your gloves must never be removed in public, even during meals, making simple tasks like writing or handling delicate objects frustratingly difficult. But the physical constraints pale in comparison to the emotional and intellectual restrictions that defined Victorian womanhood. You are expected to be the angel in the house, a phrase popularised by poet Coventry Patmore that sounds lovely until you realise it means complete self-sacrifice and the absolute suppression of any desires that might conflict with your family's needs. Your own opinions must never contradict your husband's, even in private conversation. Your knowledge should be limited to domestic affairs, music, and perhaps a bit of French. Too much education was considered dangerous for the female mind and would lead to that dreaded diagnosis of hysteria. The morning routine continues with breakfast, where you must eat delicately and sparingly, both because your corset makes consuming normal amounts of food impossible, and because hearty appetites in women were considered vulgar. You sip weak tea and nibble toast while your husband reads newspaper articles aloud, carefully selecting only items he deems appropriate for feminine ears. Political news, business matters, and anything involving violence or scandal are filtered out, leaving you informed only about social events, charitable activities, and the weather. The concept of hysteria dominated Victorian medical thinking about women, and you live in constant fear of exhibiting any symptoms that might earn you this label. Crying too much or too little, laughing inappropriately, expressing anger, showing excessive interest in books or ideas, experiencing sexual desire, or complaining about physical discomfort. All of these could be interpreted as signs of hysteria. The medical establishment believed that women's reproductive organs controlled their emotional and mental state, making them inherently unstable and prone to irrational behavior. Dr. Edward Clark, a prominent Harvard physician, published a widely read book in 1873 arguing that education was physically dangerous for women because it diverted energy away from their reproductive organs, potentially causing sterility, hysteria, or even death. His theories, though completely unfounded, were taken seriously by medical professionals and used to justify limiting women's access to higher education and intellectual pursuits. You've internalized these beliefs, wondering if your occasional desire to read something more challenging than a household management guide might actually be damaging your health. The social isolation inherent in Victorian domestic life compounds your struggles. While your husband goes out into the world of business and politics, engaging with other adults and facing intellectual challenges, you spend most days alone with servants and children. If you're fortunate enough to have them, your social interactions are limited to brief visits with other ladies, carefully scripted encounters where discussing anything truly meaningful would be considered improper. The conversation topics are restricted to household management, children's activities, fashion, and gentle gossip about mutual acquaintances. Anything deeper or more personal would violate social boundaries. The loneliness is profound and pervasive, seeping into every aspect of your existence. You might spend hours each day in complete silence, except for giving instructions to servants or reading to children. Your husband returns home expecting cheerful conversation and emotional support for his daily trials, but you have no outlet for your own frustrations or intellectual needs. The Victorian ideal of feminine self-sacrifice means that admitting to feeling isolated or unfulfilled would be seen as ingratitude for your privileged position as a kept woman. Evening activities provide little relief from these constraints. Family gatherings require you to play piano or sing for entertainment, but only pieces considered appropriate for mixed company. Reading is limited to novels deemed morally instructive. Anything too passionate or intellectually challenging could overexcite the feminine constitution. Your needlework must be decorative rather than practical, demonstrating your leisure status while keeping your hands occupied during social visits. Historians still argue whether Victorian medical practitioners genuinely believed women were inherently mentally fragile, or whether these beliefs served to maintain male social dominance. But the effect on women's daily lives was devastating regardless of the doctor's motivations. Every emotion you feel must be carefully monitored and controlled. Every physical sensation evaluated for signs of dangerous feminine weakness. The constant self-surveillance is exhausting, creating genuine psychological distress that then gets cited as evidence of women's natural instability. Your monthly cycles bring additional challenges that Victorian medicine handles with a mixture of ignorance and moral judgment. Menstruation is considered a time of particular mental and physical vulnerability, when you are advised to avoid any strenuous activity, including reading, writing, or thinking too hard. Some physicians recommend complete bed rest during your periods, while others suggest that physical activity during menstruation could cause permanent damage to your reproductive system. The shame surrounding normal bodily functions means you can't discuss these issues openly, leaving you to navigate physical discomfort and emotional changes without proper information or support. The cumulative effect of these restrictions creates a perfect storm of physical discomfort, emotional suppression, and psychological distress that doctors struggle to understand or treat effectively. When you finally reach the breaking point, when the corset-induced headaches become unbearable, when the loneliness makes you weep uncontrollably, when the intellectual starvation makes you feel like you're slowly disappearing, your physician has a ready solution. He reaches into his medical bag and produces a small amber bottle filled with laudanum, promising that this medicine will restore your feminine tranquility and help you embrace your natural role with proper contentment. You're sitting in a Victorian physician consultation room, watching as Doctor Pemberton adjusts his spectacles and examines the array of amber bottles lined up on his mahogany desk like liquid soldiers ready for medical battle. The gas lamp flickers softly, casting dancing shadows across the walls lined with leather-bound medical texts that contain more superstition than science. Heavy velvet drapes muffle the sounds of horse-drawn carriages outside, creating an atmosphere of hushed medical authority that makes you feel both reassured and slightly intimidated. You've come to him with complaints that seem perfectly reasonable to modern ears: chronic headaches from your daily corseting, sleeplessness from anxiety about your children's health, and persistent melancholy that you can't quite shake despite your comfortable circumstances. The good doctor nods sympathetically as you describe your symptoms, occasionally making notes with his fountain pen in a leather-bound journal filled with similar cases. His consultation room reflects his professional status. Persian rugs, oil paintings of distinguished medical predecessors, and shelves lined with medical instruments that gleam with brass and steel authority. What you don't realise is that you've just described the perfect candidate for laudanum treatment, according to Victorian medical wisdom. Doctor. Pemberton reaches for one of his bottles and begins explaining how this miraculous tincture will restore your natural feminine equilibrium and allow you to fulfill your domestic duties with renewed vigour and contentment. Laudanum, he says in his most reassuring bedside manner, polishing the bottle's amber surface with a silk cloth, is nature's own remedy for the delicate constitutions that characterise the gentler sex. He measures out exactly 15 drops into a small crystal glass of water, stirring it with a silver spoon until the liquid turns a pale amber colour that catches the lamplight like liquid gold. This preparation contains the finest opium from our colonies in India, combined with alcohol to aid absorption and a touch of saffron for palatability. It will calm your nerves, ease your headaches, and restore the natural tranquility that is woman's greatest virtue. Doctor. Pemberton's confidence is absolute and infectious. He speaks of laudanum with the same reverence that medieval monks might have reserved for holy relics, explaining how this ancient medicine has been refined by centuries of medical progress to provide the perfect treatment for feminine ailments. His training at Edinburgh Medical School, he mentions proudly, included extensive study of opiate therapies under professors who had pioneered their use in treating what they called nervous disorders of the fairer sex. The first dose seems like divine intervention. Within minutes of drinking the slightly bitter mixture, you feel a warm, spreading sensation through your chest and limbs, as if someone had wrapped you in the softest cashmere shawl. The constant ache in your ribs from your corset fades to a dull whisper. The anxiety that normally knots your stomach begins to dissolve, replaced by a floating sense of well-being that you haven't experienced since childhood. Your thoughts, usually racing with worry about household management and social obligations, slow to a peaceful drift that feels like sinking into a warm bath after a long, difficult day. For the first time in months, perhaps years, you feel truly relaxed. The tight knot of responsibility that usually sits between your shoulder blades simply melts away. Colours seem more vivid, sounds more pleasant, and even the gaslight appears to glow with a warmer, more welcoming radiance. You find yourself smiling without conscious effort, feeling genuinely optimistic about returning home to face the endless demands of Victorian domestic life. Doctor. Pemberton observes your transformation with professional satisfaction, making careful notes about the speed and completeness of your response to treatment. You see how quickly the medicine takes effect. This is precisely what your constitution requires, a gentle restoration of nervous balance. He prescribes a regimen that seems perfectly reasonable, 10 drops in the morning to start your day with proper composure, another 10 drops with your afternoon tea to maintain equilibrium, and 15 drops before bed to ensure restful sleep. Many of my most refined patients rely on this treatment, he assures you, mentioning several prominent society ladies whose names you recognise from charity committees and social gatherings. The doctor's references to other patients using laudanum successfully reinforces your sense that this is simply another aspect of proper Victorian healthcare, like taking the waters at Bath or following prescribed diets of various ailments. Mrs. Hartwell from the Ladies' Charitable Society, he mentions discreetly, has found laudanum invaluable for managing the stress of organising fundraising events. Lady Pembroke uses it to maintain her composure during the demanding social season. These testimonials make you feel part of an exclusive circle of refined women who have discovered the secret to managing their delicate constitutions. What Dr. Pemberton doesn't explain is that laudanum's effectiveness comes from its high concentration of morphine, typically about 10% of the liquid's total volume. Your prescribed daily dose contains roughly the equivalent of a modern prescription painkiller, but delivered in a form that creates faster absorption and more intense effects. The alcohol component, often comprising another 10 to 15% of the mixture, adds its own intoxicating properties while helping the opium cross more quickly into your bloodstream. Victorian physicians like Dr. Pemberton genuinely believed they were providing compassionate medical care based on the best available scientific knowledge. The era's medical training emphasized treating symptoms rather than understanding underlying causes, and laudanum was remarkably effective at eliminating almost any complaint a patient might present: headaches, insomnia, anxiety, digestive problems, menstrual pain, post-childbirth discomfort, grief, tuberculosis symptoms, and even childhood behavioural issues all seem to improve dramatically with regular opium treatment. Medical schools taught standardised laudanum, prescribing protocols that students memorise like mathematical formulas: 10 drops for mild nervous agitation, 15 for moderate melancholy, 20 for severe hysteria, with adjustments based on the patient's age, weight, and social class. The dosing guidelines made no distinction between temporary relief and long-term treatment, assuming that patients would naturally discontinue use once their symptoms resolved. The medical establishment's confidence in laudanum was reinforced by centuries of successful use and the endorsement of respected physicians like Thomas Sydenham, whose medical textbooks were still considered authoritative in Victorian medical schools. Students learned to prescribe laudanum with the same confidence modern doctors might recommend antibiotics. Without any understanding of addiction potential or long-term consequences, Professor Matthews at Guy's Hospital Medical School famously declared that a physician without laudanum is like a carpenter without nails, lacking the most essential tool of his trade. Your daily laudanum routine quickly becomes as essential as your morning corset lacing. You wake anticipating that first dose that will make the day's physical discomforts bearable and transform the prospect of household management from overwhelming burden to manageable responsibility. The morning ritual becomes almost ceremonial, measuring the drops carefully into a small glass, adding just enough water to dilute the bitter taste. Then drinking it while standing at your bedroom window watching the city wake up below. The afternoon dose helps you maintain your composure during social visits and household crises that might otherwise trigger the kind of emotional display that would mark you as hysterical. When the cook burns the evening roast, or your youngest child develops a fever, you handle these emergencies with the calm efficiency that laudanum provides. The evening dose ensures the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that refreshes you for another day of Victorian womanhood, free from the anxious thoughts that once kept you staring at the ceiling for hours. Within weeks, you've unconsciously adjusted your entire schedule around these 3 crucial moments of medicinal relief. Social engagements are planned to allow time for your doses to take effect. Shopping expeditions are timed to avoid the periods when laudanum's effects are wearing off. Even intimate moments with your husband are influenced by when you last took your medicine. Though you would never admit the connection even to yourself, the transformation in your daily experience is remarkable and exactly what Dr. Pemberton promised. Tasks that once felt overwhelming, managing servants, planning dinner parties, maintaining correspondence with distant relatives, organising charity committee meetings, become manageable under laudanum's gentle influence. You find yourself more patient with your children's noise and demands, more tolerant of your husband's expectations for emotional support after his business difficulties, and better able to maintain the serene demeanour that society expects from refined ladies. Friends and family members comment positively on these changes. Your mother-in-law, who had previously criticised your tendency toward nervous agitation, now praises your improved composure during family gatherings. Your husband expresses appreciation for your more consistent cheerfulness and your reduced complaints about physical discomfort. Society acquaintances remark on how well you look, how calm and graceful you seem, how effortlessly you handle domestic challenges that would overwhelm less capable women. But something subtle is changing in your relationship with the medicine, though you don't yet recognise these shifts as warning signs. The prescribed doses that initially provided hours of relief now seem to last for shorter periods. You notice the effects wearing off more quickly, leaving you feeling slightly anxious or uncomfortable until your next scheduled dose. Sometimes you find yourself watching the ornate mantel clock in your drawing room, counting the hours until you can respectably take your next measure of laudanum without appearing too eager for your medicine. Historians still argue whether Victorian physicians were willfully ignorant about opium's addictive properties, or whether they lacked the scientific framework to understand dependency as a medical condition distinct from moral weakness. But the evidence suggests that most doctors genuinely believed they were providing beneficial treatment, interpreting patients' increasing tolerance as proof of medical effectiveness, rather than warning signs of developing addiction. You're gliding through the ornate corridors of Belmont Manor, where Lady Catherine Ashworth hosts her famous afternoon salons. But today you notice something different in the air beyond the usual scent of hothouse roses and expensive French perfume. There's an underlying sweetness, almost medicinal, that seems to drift from the elegant ladies gathered in small clusters throughout the drawing room. As you accept a delicate porcelain teacup from a uniformed servant, you observe how several of the most distinguished women in London society discreetly add drops from small amber bottles to their afternoon refreshments. Mrs. Helena Fitzgerald, wife of a prominent banker, sits gracefully on a velvet settee, her posture perfect despite the restrictive corset beneath her silk gown. She smiles serenely as she listens to gossip about the latest parliamentary scandal. But you notice how her gloved fingers periodically reach into her beaded reticule to touch something small and round, undoubtedly one of those precious laudanum bottles that have become as essential to fashionable ladies as their smelling salts and silk handkerchiefs. "My dear," Lady Ashworth whispers confidentially as she settles beside you, "have you tried Dr. Morrison's new preparation? It's remarkably effective for maintaining one's equilibrium during these trying social seasons." She produces an exquisite cut crystal bottle from her sleeve, no larger than a thimble, with L. Morrison, tonic for feminine nerves, etched in flowing script. The liquid inside catches the afternoon light streaming through tall windows, creating rainbow prisms that dance across the Persian carpet. What you're witnessing is the transformation of laudanum from medical necessity to social accessory among Britain's upper classes. These women haven't stumbled into drug dependency through desperation or moral weakness. They've been guided there by the finest physicians money can buy. Men who attended Oxford and Edinburgh, who treat royalty and write learned papers for medical journals. The laudanum they consume is prepared by prestigious chemists, packaged in elegant bottles that wouldn't look out of place among expensive perfumes and cosmetics. Lady Pembroke joins your conversation, floating across the room with the kind of ethereal grace that can only come from a recent dose of opium. Her pupils are slightly constricted, and her usual sharp wit has been softened into dreamy observations about the beautiful patterns in the wallpaper and how marvellously the light plays across everyone's faces. I find Dr. Whitmore's formula particularly suited to social gatherings, she confides, producing her own bottle, this one made of deep blue glass with silver filigree work. It provides just the right amount of perspective to make even the most tedious conversations fascinating. The afternoon progresses with the strange, languid rhythm that characterizes gatherings where multiple participants are under opium's influence. Conversations meander through topics with dreamlike logic, jumping from fashion to philosophy to childhood memories with no apparent connection beyond the speaker's altered mental states. Laughter comes more easily and lasts longer than usual. Several ladies become unusually animated, sharing personal details they would normally keep private, while others sink into contemplative silences that might last for minutes at a time. You observe Mrs. Blackwood, whose husband recently suffered significant financial losses in a railway speculation scheme, maintaining perfect composure despite what should be devastating social embarrassment. Under laudanum's influence, the potential loss of their country estate and London townhouse seems like distant concerns rather than immediate catastrophes. She speaks of possibly having to dismiss half their servants with the same dreamy detachment she might use to discuss changing her hairstyle. The most telling moment comes when young Miss Adelaide Thornton, barely 18 and recently married, begins weeping over her teacup for no apparent reason. The other ladies respond not with alarm but with knowing sympathy, several producing their own bottles to offer her comfort. Lady Ashworth explains matter-of-factly that Adelaide is still adjusting her constitution to married life and needs slightly stronger medicine than unmarried girls require. The casual way these respectable women discuss dosages and effectiveness reveals how thoroughly laudanum has been integrated into their understanding of feminine health care. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, Lady Ashworth's personal physician, arrives for his weekly consultation disguised as a social call. He moves through the room with professional discretion, engaging in light conversation while observing his patients' responses to their prescribed treatments. You watch him make mental notes as he speaks with each woman, assessing their speech patterns, pupil dilation, and general demeanour to determine whether dosage adjustments might be necessary. Mrs. Fitzgerald seems to be responding beautifully to the increased morning dose, he murmurs to Lady Ashworth, though she might benefit from a lighter afternoon preparation to maintain social alertness. His recommendations sound like discussions of fashion accessories rather than medical interventions, and the ladies receive his advice with the same attention they might give to suggestions about jewellery or hairstyles. The afternoon's entertainment reveals another dimension of high society laudanum culture. Lady Pembroke performs a piano piece with unusual emotional intensity. Her normally precise technique transformed into something more expressive and free-flowing. Mrs. Hartington recites poetry with a passionate delivery that would normally embarrass her reserved personality. Several ladies engage in conversations about literature, art, and music with insights they would never express in their normal social interactions. Historians still argue whether these gatherings represented genuine artistic salons enhanced by opium's creativity-stimulating effects, or simply the collective delusions of addicted women. But the participants themselves felt they were experiencing elevated cultural experiences. The laudanum seemed to strip away social inhibitions and conventional thinking, allowing these highly educated but normally constrained women to express ideas and emotions that Victorian society typically suppressed. The servants at these gatherings develop their own expertise in managing opium-influenced guests. Footmen learn to move more slowly and speak more softly to avoid startling ladies whose senses have been heightened by laudanum. Housemaids become skilled at cleaning up the inevitable spills that occur when guests lose track of their teacups or misjudge distances. The cook prepares lighter refreshments, knowing that opium typically suppresses appetite while making sweet flavours more appealing. As evening approaches, you notice the gradual changes in the gathering's atmosphere. Earlier euphoria gives way to contemplative quiet. Some ladies become fixated on specific objects, staring at candle flames, tracing patterns in fabric, or listening intently to sounds that others cannot detect. A few experience what they delicately call the vapours, sudden emotional shifts that send them retreating to quiet corners or requesting private conversations with their hostess. Lady Ashworth manages these developments with practiced skill, maintaining the appearance of a normal social gathering while discreetly addressing the needs of guests whose laudanum effects are becoming more pronounced. She arranges for quiet seating areas, provides additional refreshments for those experiencing nausea, and ensures that carriages are available for ladies who suddenly feel the need to return home to the privacy of their own chambers. The most sophisticated aspect of this high society laudanum culture is its self-perpetuating nature. Newcomers to these circles quickly learn that participation requires the right kind of medicinal support. Established members become informal mentors, recommending physicians, sharing preferred formulations, and offering guidance on managing dosages for different social occasions. What begins as medical treatment evolves into an essential skill for navigating elite social networks. As you prepare to leave Belmont Manor, Lady Ashworth presents you with a small gift, an ornate silver case designed to hold laudanum bottles discreetly. Every refined lady needs proper accessories for her constitutional requirements, she explains with a knowing smile. The case is beautiful enough to display openly, yet designed to conceal its true purpose from servants and family members who might not understand the medical necessity of its contents. Your carriage ride home passes in a haze of opium-enhanced sensations. The rhythm of hooves on cobblestone sounds musical. The gas streetlights create halos of warm colour, and even the harsh London air seems perfumed with mysterious fragrances. You realise that you've been inducted into a secret society that exists within respectable Victorian culture, one where Britain's most privileged women have found a pharmaceutical solution to the emotional and physical constraints of their gilded lives. You're standing in the cold, echoing corridors of Bethlehem Royal Hospital, better known as Bedlam, where the screams and incoherent babbling of the inmates create a symphony of human suffering that penetrates even the thick stone walls. The air smells of carbolic acid, unwashed bodies, and something else you can't quite identify. A sweet, cloying scent that follows certain patients like an invisible cloud. As you walk past row after row of cells, you begin to notice a disturbing pattern among the women confined here. Many of them clutch empty amber bottles to their chests like sacred relics, muttering about medicine they desperately need but can no longer obtain. Dr. Mortimer Blackstone, the hospital's chief alienist, guides you through the women's ward with clinical detachment, occasionally pausing to point out particularly interesting cases. This ward houses approximately 200 female patients, he explains, his keys jangling as he unlocks another heavy door. And I estimate that nearly 40% arrived here directly as a result of complications from laudanum dependency. He speaks of these women as medical specimens rather than human beings, noting their symptoms with the same enthusiasm a botanist might display when cataloguing exotic plants. In cell 47 you encounter Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, once the refined wife of a successful textile manufacturer. Now she presses her face against the bars, her formerly elegant features gaunt and wild-eyed, begging anyone who passes to bring her just a few drops of her medicine. Her story, as recorded in the hospital's admission notes, follows a tragically familiar pattern. Prescribed laudanum for post-childbirth melancholy, gradual increase in dosage, erratic behaviour that alarmed her family, and finally a complete breakdown when her physician attempted to reduce her daily doses. The women in this section, Dr. Blackstone continues with professional pride, represent a fascinating study in the effects of opium withdrawal on the feminine constitution. Observe how Mrs. Whitmore exhibits the classic symptoms, violent tremors, persistent hallucinations, and an obsessive focus on obtaining her former medication. He makes notes in a leather-bound journal as Margaret claws at the air, apparently trying to catch invisible insects that only she can see. The next cell contains Lady Beatrice Hartwell, whose husband brought her here after she attacked a housemaid with a fireplace poker during what the family diplomatically termed one of her episodes. Lady Beatrice sits in the corner, rocking back and forth while humming nursery songs she once sang to her children. Her laudanum addiction began innocently enough, drops for the pain of a difficult labour, then continued use for what her physician called nervous exhaustion from maternal duties. When her tolerance required increasingly large doses, her behaviour became unpredictable and sometimes violent. The aristocratic patients present particularly complex cases. Dr. Blackstone observes, watching Lady Beatrice with clinical fascination. Their addiction often progresses more rapidly due to access to higher quality preparations and multiple physicians prescribing simultaneously. Lady Beatrice was receiving laudanum from 3 different doctors, each unaware of the other's treatments, resulting in daily consumption equivalent to what we might use to anaesthetize surgical patients. You move through the ward, encountering case after case of women whose stories share devastating similarities. Mrs. Catherine Mills, a baker's wife, began taking laudanum for chronic pain from lifting heavy trays, gradually increasing her doses until she was spending the family's entire weekly income on medicine. When her husband tried to limit her access to money for laudanum, she sold household possessions, borrowed from neighbours, and finally resorted to theft. Her admission notes describe her as violent, delusional, and exhibiting moral insanity characteristic of opium dependency. The medical records reveal the shocking scope of laudanum-related admissions. Dr. Blackstone shows you statistics he's compiled over the past 5 years. Women admitted for laudanum-induced insanity represent the fastest-growing category of patients in British asylums. The numbers have doubled every 18 months, with no signs of the trend slowing. Most disturbing is that these women come from respectable backgrounds, middle-class housewives, merchants' wives, and even nobility, rather than the working-class women who typically comprised asylum populations. In the asylum's treatment rooms, you witness the primitive methods Victorian medicine employed to address opium addiction. Dr. Blackstone demonstrates the water cure, where patients are subjected to alternating hot and cold baths designed to shock their systems back to normal function. The cold baths are particularly brutal. Patients are submerged in near-freezing water until they lose consciousness, then revived with smelling salts and warm blankets. The shock to the nervous system, he explains, is thought to reset the patient's constitutional balance and eliminate the craving for artificial stimulation. Other treatments include mechanical restraints designed to prevent patients from harming themselves during withdrawal, purging with mercury-based compounds to cleanse the system of opiate corruption, and bleeding to reduce what physicians called excess nervous energy. The irony is profound. These women, who initially sought medical help for legitimate ailments, are now subjected to treatments that would be considered torture by modern standards. Mrs. Ellen Ashford's case illustrates the particular tragedy facing mothers who become addicted to laudanum. She was prescribed the medicine after a difficult childbirth that left her with chronic pain and what doctors diagnosed as maternal melancholia. As her dependency deepened, her ability to care for her 3 young children deteriorated. The admission notes describe finding her children alone in their home for several days while she remained unconscious from an opium overdose. Her husband had her committed not from cruelty, but from desperation to save both her and their children. The children of laudanum-addicted mothers face their own tragic circumstances. Many are raised by relatives or placed in workhouses when their mothers become incapacitated by addiction. Some children are born already dependent on opium, having received it through their mother's milk, creating a second generation of addiction that physicians struggle to understand or treat. Doctor. Blackstone mentions several cases of infants who died during opium withdrawal, their tiny systems unable to survive the shock of sudden cessation. You observe the daily routine in the women's ward, which revolves around managing the various stages of opium withdrawal and addiction-related mental disturbances. Morning rounds involve checking on patients who spent the night in physical restraints, many of whom injured themselves trying to escape imaginary threats or obtain medicine they believe is hidden in their cells. Afternoon activities include primitive occupational therapy, simple needlework or basket weaving designed to keep patients' hands busy and minds occupied. The most heartbreaking aspect of these cases is the lucid moments when patients temporarily regain their former personalities. Mrs. Whitmore occasionally recognizes visitors and speaks coherently about her children, expressing desperate shame about her condition and begging for help in overcoming her dependency. These moments of clarity make her subsequent relapses into delusional behavior even more tragic, as observers can see glimpses of the refined woman she once was. Historians still argue whether Victorian asylums were genuinely attempting to cure laudanum addiction, or simply warehousing inconvenient women whose behavior had become socially unacceptable. But the evidence suggests that most physicians believed they were providing the best available treatment. The primitive understanding of addiction as a medical condition, rather than a moral failing, was just beginning to emerge. And treatment methods reflected this confusion about whether dependency represented physical illness, mental weakness, or spiritual corruption. Doctor. Blackstone's records reveal another disturbing pattern: the high rate of laudanum addiction among the wives and daughters of physicians themselves. Several doctors' families are represented in the asylum population, suggesting that medical professionals' easy access to opium preparations created particular risks for their own households. These cases are handled with special discretion, often listed under false names or euphemistic diagnoses to protect professional reputations. The financial burden of caring for laudanum-addicted women falls heavily on families and institutions. Private patients like Lady Beatrice pay substantial fees for confinement, but most families eventually exhaust their resources supporting a dependent member's medical treatment. The resulting admissions to county asylums strain public resources and create overcrowding that makes effective treatment even more difficult. As you prepare to leave Bethlehem, Doctor, Blackstone shares his most troubling observation. The rate of laudanum-related admissions continues accelerating, with no signs of medical or social recognition of the growing epidemic. These women, he says, gesturing toward the cells full of former ladies and respectable wives, represent merely the visible portion of a much larger problem. For every woman confined here, dozens more remain in private homes, their families managing their addiction in secret to avoid social disgrace. You're settling into the dimly lit study of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, where the gas lamps cast dancing shadows across stacks of manuscript pages scattered around a well-worn writing desk. The air carries the familiar sweet scent you've learned to associate with laudanum, mixed with the smell of ink, parchment, and the hothouse flowers that poets seem to favour. Elizabeth sits at her desk. A small amber bottle within easy reach of her writing hand, and you realise you're about to witness how opium's influence shaped some of the most celebrated literature of the Victorian era. The medicine opens doors in my mind, Elizabeth confides as she measures drops into a crystal glass, her movements practised and precise. Without it, the pain from my spinal injury makes concentration impossible. But with just the right amount, she pauses to sip her laudanum-laced water, then continues with a dreamy smile. The words flow like music, and I can see connections between ideas that remain hidden in ordinary consciousness. Her eyes take on that familiar glazed quality you've observed in other laudanum users, but her voice becomes more animated as she describes the creative process under opium's influence. What you're witnessing represents a fascinating and troubling intersection between pharmaceutical dependency and literary genius. Elizabeth's laudanum use began legitimately, prescribed for the chronic pain and breathing difficulties that plagued her since childhood, but evolved into something far more complex. She discovered that opium didn't just relieve physical suffering, it transformed her mental processes in ways that seemed to enhance her poetic abilities. Under laudanum's influence, she wrote some of her most acclaimed works, including passages from Aurora Leigh and many of the sonnets from the Portuguese. The study walls are lined with portraits of other literary figures whose creative processes were similarly influenced by opium. Samuel Taylor Coleridge gazes down from one frame, his eyes holding the same dreamy intensity you've seen in contemporary laudanum users. His masterpiece, Kubla Khan, famously emerged from an opium-induced dream state. Though he claimed the poem was incomplete because a visitor interrupted his drug-enhanced reverie, the connection between opium and creative inspiration has become so established that some writers view laudanum dependency as an occupational hazard rather than a medical condition. Elizabeth shows you her writing routine, which revolves entirely around carefully timed laudanum doses. She takes her first measure upon waking, allowing the medicine time to work before beginning her morning correspondence. The afternoon dose comes before her serious writing sessions, when she works on poetry and longer prose pieces. Evening doses help her review and revise the day's work, often leading to insights that seemed impossible during more sober moments. People assume the laudanum makes me drowsy or confused, she explains while examining a recent poem, but the opposite is true. In the proper dosage, it sharpens my perceptions and allows me to access emotional depths that remain closed during ordinary consciousness. She points to specific passages that she claims were written under opium's influence, noting how the imagery becomes more vivid and the emotional resonance more powerful when she writes while medicated. The literary salons you attend with Elizabeth reveal how widespread laudanum use has become among female writers and intellectuals. Mrs. Caroline Norton, the novelist and social reformer, discreetly adds drops to her tea while discussing her latest work challenging women's legal status. Miss Christina Rossetti speaks passionately about symbolism in poetry, her pupils constricted and her normally reserved personality transformed into something more expressive and philosophical. These gatherings have an otherworldly quality, with conversations that meander through literary theory, personal revelations, and shared creative visions that seem to emerge from collective altered consciousness. The creative process you observe under laudanum's influence is genuinely remarkable, even as its destructive potential becomes increasingly apparent. Elizabeth writes with unusual speed and fluency when properly medicated, producing pages of verse that flow with minimal revision. Her descriptions of emotional states become more precise and evocative, her metaphors more surprising and effective. However, you also notice that her handwriting becomes less controlled as doses increase, and her ability to maintain consistent quality varies dramatically depending on her medication timing. George Eliot joins one of your literary gatherings, though she maintains strict sobriety that sets her apart from her laudanum-using colleagues. She observes the other writers with fascination tinged by concern, noting how their creative insights often come at the cost of practical functioning. The medicine seems to unlock certain creative faculties, she admits privately, but I fear the price may be too high. I've watched too many talented women sacrifice their health and relationships for these artificial inspirations. The conversation turns to Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published several decades earlier, which provided the first detailed account of opium's effects on literary creativity. The women discuss his descriptions of enhanced perceptions, vivid dreams, and the terrible withdrawal symptoms he endured when attempting to reduce his usage. For many female writers, De Quincey's work serves as both inspiration and warning about the seductive power of opium-enhanced creativity. Elizabeth reveals the darker side of her laudanum dependency when she attempts to reduce her daily doses at her husband Robert's urging. The withdrawal symptoms prove devastating, not just physically, but creatively. Without the medicine, she confesses, my mind feels flat and colourless. The poetic insights that seem so natural under laudanum's influence disappear entirely. I can barely compose a coherent letter, much less poetry that moves the soul. Her description of creative withdrawal, the feeling that her artistic abilities have vanished along with the drug, helps explain why so many talented women remain trapped in opium dependency. The financial pressures of maintaining laudanum supplies while pursuing literary careers create additional complications for female writers. Unlike male authors who might have independent incomes or professional positions, women depend on literary earnings that are often sporadic and insufficient. Elizabeth describes periods when she rationed her laudanum carefully, taking smaller doses to make supplies last longer, only to find that her reduced medication made writing effectively impossible, thereby reducing her income further. You witness the tragic cycle that traps many literary women in escalating laudanum dependency. Initial use provides genuine relief from physical ailments while enhancing creative abilities, leading to increased productivity and literary success. However, tolerance requires gradually increasing doses, and the fear of losing creative inspiration makes reducing usage seem impossible. The very success that laudanum initially enabled becomes dependent on maintaining higher and higher levels of opium consumption. Historians still argue whether laudanum actually enhanced these writers' creative abilities or simply provided the pain relief and emotional stability necessary for sustained creative work. But the subjective experience of the writers themselves suggests that opium altered their creative processes in profound ways. Elizabeth and her contemporaries genuinely believed that their best work emerged from laudanum-influenced sessions, and they feared that sobriety would end their literary careers. The letters between laudanum-using female writers reveal a secret support network where they share information about suppliers, effective dosages for creative work, and strategies for managing dependency while maintaining productive careers. These correspondences read like coded discussions of a shared addiction, with elaborate euphemisms for laudanum and careful instructions for obtaining reliable supplies without attracting unwanted attention from family members or physicians. The most tragic aspect of this literary laudanum culture is how it normalized drug dependency among educated, creative women. What began as medical treatment for legitimate ailments evolved into an essential tool for intellectual and artistic achievement. The women who succeeded in combining laudanum use with literary productivity became role models for younger writers, who viewed opium dependency as a necessary sacrifice for serious creative work, rather than recognizing it as a dangerous medical condition that happened to coincide with their artistic achievements. As evening approaches and Elizabeth prepares her final dose of the day, she reflects on the impossible choice facing creative women in her position. Perhaps future generations will find ways to unlock these creative states without pharmaceutical assistance, she muses. But for now, the medicine remains my key to the artistic realms I could never access through will alone. Her words capture the tragedy of talented women who found genuine creative enhancement through opium use, making recovery feel like artistic suicide rather than medical necessity. You're sitting in the prestigious consultation room of Dr. Reginald Pemberton, where medical diplomas from Cambridge and Edinburgh line the mahogany-panelled walls like certificates of divine authority. The leather-bound medical journals stacked on his desk contain the latest theories about feminine constitution and nervous disorders. But as you watch him confidently prescribe increasing doses of laudanum to patient after patient, you realise that Victorian medicine's understanding of addiction hovers somewhere between primitive and non-existent. Doctor. Pemberton adjusts his wire-rimmed spectacles as he examines Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, a young woman whose trembling hands and dilated pupils clearly indicate advanced laudanum dependency. Yet he interprets these symptoms through the lens of Victorian medical theory, noting in his careful handwriting that the patient exhibits heightened nervous sensitivity, characteristic of refined feminine constitution under therapeutic opiate influence. What modern medicine would recognise as classic withdrawal symptoms, he diagnoses as evidence that his treatment is working exactly as intended. The patient's increased responsiveness to environmental stimuli. He explains to his medical assistant while Mrs. Thornton sits nearby, clearly struggling to maintain composure, demonstrates the laudanum's beneficial effects on her nervous system. We shall increase the morning dose to 25 drops and add an additional 15 drops at midday to maintain therapeutic equilibrium. His confidence is absolute, backed by medical training that taught him to view opium as one of medicine's most reliable and beneficial substances. The medical education that shaped Dr. Pemberton's understanding of laudanum reflects the broader ignorance of his era regarding addiction mechanisms. At Edinburgh Medical School, students learned that opium dependency resulted from moral weakness rather than physiological changes in brain chemistry. Professors taught that properly bred patients, particularly refined ladies, possess sufficient willpower to discontinue medication when their underlying conditions improved. The concept that the medicine itself could create irresistible physical cravings was simply not part of medical thinking. Doctor. Pemberton's case notes reveal the systematic way Victorian physicians misinterpreted addiction symptoms. When patients reported that their prescribed doses no longer provided adequate relief, doctors viewed this as evidence of underlying condition progression rather than tolerance development. Increased irritability between doses was attributed to returning nervous disorders rather than withdrawal symptoms. The desperate behaviour exhibited by patients seeking additional laudanum was diagnosed as hysteria, requiring stronger medication rather than dependency requiring gradual reduction. You observe, Doctor, Pemberton's morning routine, which includes reviewing correspondence from colleagues across Britain who share their experiences with opiate therapy. Doctor. Morrison in Bath reports excellent results treating feminine melancholia with graduated laudanum increases. Doctor. Whitmore in Manchester describes a new preparation combining laudanum with chloral hydrate that provides remarkable tranquilizing effects for agitated female patients. These professional exchanges reinforce each doctor's confidence that they're participating in cutting-edge medical practice, rather than creating widespread addiction. The pharmaceutical industry that supplies these physicians operates with equally dangerous ignorance about their product's addictive potential. You visit the laboratories of Burroughs Wellcome, where chemists prepare standardized laudanum solutions with scientific precision while remaining completely unaware of the neurological changes their products create in regular users. The quality control focuses entirely on opium concentration and alcohol content, with no consideration of dependency risks or withdrawal management. Dr. Pemberton shows you his patient records, which he maintains with meticulous detail as part of what he considers groundbreaking research into feminine nervous disorders. The progression documented in these files would be immediately recognizable to modern addiction specialists: initial effective relief at low doses, gradual tolerance requiring increased amounts, behavioral changes as dependency deepens, and eventually complete psychological and physical reliance on the substance. Yet Dr. Pemberton interprets this progression as successful long-term management of chronic feminine constitutional weakness. The medical conferences where Dr. Pemberton presents his findings reveal the collective delusion of the Victorian medical establishment regarding opium therapy. At the Royal College of Physicians, he delivers papers with titles like Therapeutic Applications of Graduated Laudanum Protocols in Feminine Nervous Disorders and Constitutional Benefits of Long-Term Opiate Therapy for Delicate Female Patients. His colleagues respond with professional admiration, requesting copies of his treatment protocols and sharing their own successes with similar approaches. The case of Mrs. Beatrice Hartwell illustrates how medical ignorance compounds individual tragedies. She initially consulted Dr. Pemberton for legitimate post-surgical pain following a difficult gynecological procedure. His prescribed laudanum provided genuine relief. But as her tolerance developed, he interpreted her requests for increased medication as evidence of surgical complications requiring extended treatment. Over 18 months, her daily dosage increased from 10 drops to over 60, while Dr. Pemberton documented her case as a triumph of sustained opiate therapy, preventing chronic invalidism. Victorian medical literature of the period contains numerous articles praising long-term laudanum treatment for various conditions affecting women. The British Medical Journal publishes case studies describing patients who've taken daily opium for years without apparent ill effects, holding these up as evidence of the drug's safety for extended use. The authors of these articles completely fail to recognize that their successful long-term patients have simply developed stable addiction that requires consistent medication to prevent withdrawal symptoms. Dr. Pemberton's training includes extensive study of ancient medical texts that describe opium's beneficial effects, but no instruction in recognizing or treating dependency. When he encounters patients exhibiting what he calls opiate enthusiasm, desperate behavior focused on obtaining medication, he prescribes additional drugs like bromides or chloral to calm their agitation, rather than considering that the laudanum itself might be causing their distress. His medical bag contains an array of substances designed to manage the secondary effects of opium addiction without ever addressing the primary dependency. The economic incentives driving Victorian medical practice further entrench dangerous prescribing patterns. Dr. Pemberton maintains a comfortable lifestyle treating wealthy ladies for chronic conditions, requiring regular consultations and ongoing medication. Patients who remain dependent on his prescribed treatments provide steady income, while successfully cured patients represent lost revenue. Although he would vehemently deny any conscious financial motivation for maintaining patients' dependency, the economic structure of private medical practice creates subtle pressure to continue treatments that keep patients returning regularly. The consultation you observe with Lady Catherine Ashworth demonstrates how social status influences medical decision-making in ways that increase addiction risk. Because Lady Ashworth is wealthy and socially prominent, Dr. Pemberton prescribes higher quality laudanum preparations in elegant bottles, assumes she can safely self-administer larger doses, and accepts her reports of symptom severity without question. Her refinement and intelligence convince him that she couldn't possibly develop the kind of desperate dependency he associates with lower-class patients, making him blind to clear signs of escalating addiction. Historians still argue whether Victorian physicians like Dr. Pemberton were willfully negligent or genuinely ignorant about opium addiction, but the evidence suggests a complex mixture of both. The medical education system provided no framework for understanding dependency as a distinct medical condition. While the social and economic incentives of private practice discouraged careful examination of treatment outcomes, the result was a generation of well-intentioned physicians who created widespread addiction while sincerely believing they were providing compassionate, scientific medical care. Dr. Pemberton's personal medicine cabinet, which he shows you with professional pride, contains his own supply of laudanum for occasional use during particularly stressful periods. Even physicians require constitutional support during demanding times, he explains, apparently unaware of the irony in his words. His casual personal use of the same substance he prescribes to patients reveals how thoroughly the medical profession has normalized opium consumption while remaining blind to its dangers. The most disturbing aspect of Dr. Pemberton's practice is his complete confidence in his approach, reinforced by grateful letters from patients whose lives have been temporarily improved by laudanum's effects. These testimonials, which he keeps in a special folder marked Therapeutic Successes, describe dramatic relief from various ailments and express heartfelt appreciation for his skilled treatment. What these letters don't mention, because the patients themselves don't yet understand, is that their gratitude stems from temporary addiction management rather than genuine medical cure. As your consultation with Dr. Pemberton concludes, he presents you with a small printed pamphlet titled The Rational Use of Laudanum in Feminine Constitutional Disorders, which he has authored for distribution to other physicians. The document represents decades of medical education and professional experience. Yet every recommendation it contains would be considered dangerous malpractice by modern standards. You realize that you're holding evidence of how good intentions, combined with ignorance and social pressure, can create medical disasters that destroy thousands of lives while maintaining the appearance of scientific progress. You're creeping through the fog-shrouded alleyways behind Whitechapel's commercial district, where the respectable facade of Victorian society gives way to a shadowy economy built on desperation and addiction. The gas streetlights barely penetrate the thick London fog, and you can hear the click of heels on wet cobblestones as well-dressed women hurry through passages they would never acknowledge visiting in daylight. What you're witnessing is the birth of an underground network that serves the growing population of laudanum-dependent ladies whose prescribed medications no longer satisfy their escalating needs. Mrs. Helena Fitzgerald, whom you recognised from Lady Ashworth's elegant salon just weeks ago, pulls her silk-lined cloak tighter as she approaches a nondescript door marked only with a small brass plate reading J. Whitmore, Chemist. Her gloved hands shake slightly as she raps out what sounds like a coded pattern, and you realise that this respectable banker's wife has learned the secret signals necessary to obtain laudanum supplies beyond what her physician prescribes. The transformation from drawing-room lady to clandestine drug purchaser has happened with frightening speed. The door opens to reveal Mr. Jeremiah Whitmore, a thin man whose legitimate chemist license allows him to operate this quasi-legal business serving customers whose needs have outgrown conventional medical channels. His shop's front room displays the usual array of patent medicines, tooth powders and hair tonics. But the real business happens in the back room, where he maintains supplies of pure laudanum, raw opium, and various concentrated preparations that no respectable physician would prescribe in such quantities. Mrs. Fitzgerald, Mr. Whitmore greets his customer with professional discretion. Your usual preparation. He produces a bottle significantly larger than anything Dr. Pemberton would provide, containing laudanum concentrated to nearly twice the strength of standard medical formulations. The price, 2 guineas, represents more than most working families earn in a month, but Mrs. Fitzgerald pays without hesitation, her desperation overriding any concern about the financial drain on her household budget. You observe the careful choreography of this transaction, which maintains plausible deniability for both parties. Mr. Whitmore never explicitly acknowledges that he's selling addiction supplies to dependent patients, instead discussing constitutional tonics for nervous ladies and strengthened preparations for persistent ailments. Mrs. Fitzgerald never admits to exceeding her prescribed dosages, instead explaining that her physician's treatment requires supplementation during particularly demanding periods. This elaborate dance of euphemisms allows both parties to avoid confronting the reality of their illegal drug transaction. The customer base for these underground suppliers reveals the broad social reach of laudanum addiction among Victorian women. You witness Lady Catherine Ashworth's personal maid purchasing supplies on her mistress's behalf, using money carefully counted from the household's domestic budget. Miss Adelaide Thornton arrives in a hired cab. Having told her husband she was shopping for household linens, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore appears shortly before closing time, when fewer customers might recognise the wife of a prominent textile manufacturer engaging in what amounts to black market drug purchases. Mr. Whitmore explains his business philosophy with the rationalisation common among Victorian entrepreneurs operating in legal grey areas. These ladies suffer from genuine medical conditions, he insists, and I merely provide access to therapeutic substances when their regular physicians prove insufficiently attentive to their needs. The medical establishment's conservative approach to dosing often leaves patients undertreated and unnecessarily suffering. His self-justification reflects how addiction's economic opportunities create elaborate moral frameworks that disguise exploitation as compassionate service. The underground economy extends beyond individual chemists to include a network of suppliers, transporters, and intermediaries who facilitate access to opium products. You follow Mrs. Fitzgerald to a second location, a boarding house in Bloomsbury, where Mrs. Agatha Crowley operates what she calls a ladies' rest establishment. The parlour appears to be a conventional lodging house for travelling women, but the back rooms serve as consumption spaces where addicted ladies can take their purchased laudanum in privacy while receiving basic medical supervision. Mrs. Crowley, a former nurse who lost her hospital position due to her own laudanum dependency, has created a business model that combines drug dealing with harm reduction. She provides clean water for mixing laudanum, comfortable seating for customers experiencing strong opium effects, and basic medical intervention for women who accidentally overdose on the concentrated preparations sold by underground chemists. Her establishment operates in the grey area between legitimate nursing care and facilitating drug abuse. The financial dynamics of this underground economy reveal how addiction transforms respectable women into participants in illegal commerce. Mrs. Fitzgerald confides that she's begun selling pieces of her jewellery to fund laudanum purchases that now cost more than her household's monthly food budget. Lady Pembroke has started placing unusual demands on her dress allowance, claiming she needs additional funds for special fabrics that actually go toward purchasing opium supplies. These women, who would never consider associating with common criminals, find themselves participating in an illegal drug trade that mirrors modern narcotics trafficking in everything but social respectability. The suppliers themselves range from legitimate chemists like Mr. Whitmore, who stretch legal boundaries while maintaining professional facades, to outright criminals who have recognised the profit potential in serving addicted wealthy women. You encounter Dr. Marcus Blackwood, whose medical credentials exist only in his imagination, but whose knowledge of opium preparation rivals that of trained pharmacists. He operates from a series of rented rooms, moving locations frequently to avoid police attention, while serving customers willing to pay premium prices for his concentrated preparations. The most disturbing aspect of this underground network is how it preys on women's desperation, while maintaining Victorian social pretenses. The suppliers dress respectably, use medical terminology, and create environments that allow their customers to maintain the illusion that they're receiving a legitimate medical treatment rather than purchasing illegal drugs. Mrs. Crowley's establishment provides tea service and maintains conversation topics appropriate for respectable ladies, creating a surreal atmosphere where drug consumption happens within the familiar social framework of afternoon visiting. The law enforcement response to this underground laudanum trade reflects Victorian society's confusion about addiction and class privilege. Police rarely investigate establishments serving wealthy female customers, partly due to the legal ambiguity surrounding opium sales, and partly because prosecuting respectable ladies for drug-related crimes would create uncomfortable social complications. The few arrests that occur typically target suppliers rather than customers. And even then, sentences are often light due to judicial sympathy for the medical necessity arguments presented by defence attorneys. You witness the elaborate precautions that participants in this underground economy develop to avoid detection and social disgrace. Mrs. Fitzgerald varies her visiting patterns, using different entrances and never arriving at the same time on consecutive visits. Lady Ashworth employs her personal maid as an intermediary, maintaining plausible deniability about her own involvement in illegal drug purchases. Several women have developed code words and subtle hand signals that allow them to communicate their needs without explicit acknowledgement of illegal activity. The quality control problems in underground laudanum supplies create additional dangers for dependent women. Without the standardization that legitimate pharmaceutical companies provide, black market preparations vary wildly in potency and purity. Some suppliers dilute their products to increase profits, forcing customers to consume dangerous quantities to achieve desired effects. Others create concentrated preparations that cause accidental overdoses among women accustomed to standardized medical formulations. Historians still argue whether this underground laudanum economy represented criminal exploitation of vulnerable women or a market response to inadequate medical treatment of genuine addiction. But the evidence suggests elements of both. The suppliers genuinely believed they were providing essential services to suffering customers, while also recognizing the substantial profits available from desperate repeat customers who had few alternatives for obtaining needed supplies. As dawn approaches and the fog begins to lift from London streets, you observe the morning exodus from these underground establishments. Well-dressed women emerge from shadows and disappear into hired cabs, carrying packages that will provide temporary relief from withdrawal symptoms while ensuring their return within days. The cycle of dependency, desperation, and exploitation continues with mechanical precision, creating an invisible economy built on the suffering of Victorian ladies who began their journeys as patients seeking legitimate medical treatment, but now find themselves participants in an underground world they could never have imagined entering. You're creeping through the upstairs corridors of a respectable Victorian townhouse at 3 a.m, where the family sleeps peacefully, unaware that their wife and mother has descended into a living nightmare of hallucinations and violent mood swings. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore moves like a ghost through rooms that have become alien landscapes in her laudanum-altered perception, muttering conversations with people who exist only in her drug-addled mind, while her children sleep behind locked doors that her husband installed after her last episode. The domestic chaos begins subtly, almost imperceptibly, as Mrs. Whitmore's increasing laudanum dependency starts affecting her ability to manage household responsibilities. You observe her attempting to give instructions to the cook for the evening meal, but the words come out in disconnected fragments that make no sense. The silver. Roses must sing before. Tuesday's meat requires, Mother says the angels. The cook exchanges worried glances with the parlour-maid, both women having learned to interpret their mistress's increasingly incoherent communications, while maintaining the fiction that everything remains normal in this respectable home. The children, 10-year-old Emily, 8-year-old Thomas and 6-year-old Margaret have developed their own strategies for navigating their mother's unpredictable behaviour. They speak in whispers when she's resting, having learned that sudden noises can trigger explosive reactions. Emily, the eldest, has assumed a responsibility for protecting her younger siblings, developing an elaborate system of hand signals to warn them when mother is experiencing what they euphemistically call her difficult days. You witness the morning routine that has become a carefully choreographed dance around Mrs. Whitmore's addiction. Her husband, Charles, briefs the servants before leaving for his law practice, providing coded instructions about managing his wife's condition. Mrs. Whitmore may require additional rest today, he explains to the housekeeper, and should not be disturbed during her afternoon repose. The servants understand that additional rest means their mistress will likely spend hours in a laudanum stupor, during which they must manage the household independently while maintaining the appearance of normal domestic function. The physical deterioration is becoming impossible to hide from visitors. Mrs. Whitmore's once plump figure has become gaunt from the appetite suppression that accompanies heavy opium use. Her complexion, previously admired for its healthy glow, has taken on the waxy pallor characteristic of chronic laudanum users. Most disturbing are her eyes, often dilated to mere pinpricks during the day, then unnaturally wide during withdrawal periods, darting constantly as she responds to hallucinations that only she can see. The violent episodes that punctuate Mrs. Whitmore's addiction create the most traumatic disruptions to family life. During one incident you observe, she becomes convinced that the wallpaper in the dining room contains hidden messages from deceased relatives warning her about poisoned food. She tears at the elegant damask covering with her fingernails, screaming about conspiracies while the children huddle upstairs, and Charles attempts to physically restrain his wife without injuring her or alerting the neighbours to their domestic crisis. The children's emotional responses to their mother's condition reveal the devastating impact of parental addiction on Victorian family dynamics. Thomas has begun exhibiting nervous tics and stammering when speaking with adults outside the family. Margaret frequently asks when real Mama will come back, unable to understand why the loving mother she remembers has been replaced by this unpredictable stranger. Emily shoulders adult responsibilities while maintaining perfect academic performance at her private school, creating a facade of normalcy that exhausts her emotional resources. The financial drain of maintaining Mrs. Whitmore's increasing laudanum needs creates additional domestic stress. Charles discovers that household accounts have been mysteriously depleted, with money intended for groceries and servants' wages diverted to underground drug purchases. When he attempts to limit his wife's access to household funds, she begins selling personal possessions, first jewellery, then silver, eventually even some of the children's belongings, to finance her addiction. The family's comfortable middle-class lifestyle gradually erodes as more resources flow toward feeding Mrs. Whitmore's dependency. The servants face impossible choices between loyalty to their employers and concern for the children's welfare. Mrs. Patterson, the longtime housekeeper, has witnessed Mrs. Whitmore's complete transformation from a competent household manager into someone who can barely function during withdrawal periods. She finds herself making decisions that should belong to the lady of the house, disciplining children, managing budgets, even deciding which social invitations to accept or decline. The role reversal creates uncomfortable tensions while preserving the appearance of normal domestic hierarchy. You observe a particularly disturbing evening when Mrs. Whitmore, deep in laudanum withdrawal, becomes convinced that intruders are attempting to poison the family's water supply. She barricades herself in the kitchen, refusing to allow anyone to prepare meals and accusing the servants of participating in an elaborate assassination plot. The children go to bed hungry while Charles negotiates with his wife through a locked door. eventually persuading her to accept laudanum that restores temporary calm at the cost of reinforcing her dependency. The social isolation imposed by Mrs. Whitmore's condition affects every family member. Former friends stop calling when visits become unpredictably dramatic due to the lady of the house's altered behaviour. Dinner parties are impossible to host when the hostess might disappear mid-meal or begin carrying on animated conversations with hallucinatory guests. The children's social development suffers as they become reluctant to invite friends home, never knowing whether their mother will be lucid or lost in opium-induced fantasies. The medical professionals who visit the Whitmore household demonstrate the tragic inadequacy of Victorian addiction treatment. Doctor. Pemberton continues prescribing laudanum while attributing Mrs. Whitmore's increasing problems to nervous exhaustion requiring stronger constitutional support. When Charles suggests that the medicine itself might be causing his wife's erratic behaviour. Doctor. Pemberton dismisses this as layman's misunderstanding of therapeutic principles and prescribes additional bromides to calm what he calls secondary nervous agitation. The nighttime hours bring the most terrifying manifestations of Mrs. Whitmore's addiction. She wanders through the house having elaborate conversations with deceased relatives, rearranging furniture according to instructions from hallucinatory voices, or standing at windows for hours watching for enemies that exist only in her drug-altered perception. Charles has learned to lock away anything that could be used as a weapon during these nocturnal episodes, while the children sleep with their bedroom doors barred against their own mother. Historians still argue whether families like the Whitmores received adequate support from Victorian social institutions or whether they were abandoned to manage addiction's devastation privately. But the evidence suggests that shame and social stigma prevented most families from seeking help until situations became completely unmanageable. The emphasis on domestic privacy and respectability meant that middle-class families struggled alone with problems that might have been addressed more effectively through early intervention. The servants' gossip network ensures that news of Mrs. Whitmore's condition gradually spreads throughout their social circle. Despite Charles's efforts to maintain privacy, other families begin declining invitations and making excuses to avoid association with a household where the lady's behaviours become unpredictable and potentially embarrassing. This social ostracism compounds the family's isolation while confirming their fears about the consequences of acknowledging Mrs. Whitmore's addiction publicly. As you observe another dawn breaking over this troubled household, you realise that the Whitmore family's experience represents thousands of similar domestic tragedies playing out across Victorian Britain. Behind the facades of respectability and social order, laudanum addiction is destroying families, traumatising children, and creating domestic chaos that contradicts everything Victorian society claims to value about home, family, and feminine virtue. The medicine that promised to restore domestic tranquility has instead created homes where chaos reigns and children learn to fear the very person who should provide their greatest sense of security. You're standing in the packed gallery of Westminster Hall, where members of Parliament debate what the Times has sensationally dubbed the epidemic of female madness sweeping respectable society. The year is 1868, and the mounting evidence of laudanum's devastating effects on Victorian women has finally penetrated the consciousness of politicians, medical professionals, and social reformers who can no longer ignore the thousands of ladies whose addiction has transformed them from paragons of domestic virtue into what the press calls opium maniacs. Lord Pemberton rises to address the House of Lords, his voice carrying across the ornate chamber as he describes visiting his own constituency and finding entire neighbourhoods where the wives and daughters of respectable tradesmen have been reduced to shadow-like creatures, dependent upon foreign drugs for their daily functioning. His speech reflects the growing recognition that laudanum addiction has transcended class boundaries. affecting not just the poor and dissolute, but the very women who are supposed to embody Victorian moral superiority. The moral panic surrounding laudanum-addicted women reveals the deep contradictions in Victorian attitudes toward femininity. Medicine and social control. Dr. Mortimer Blackstone, testifying before a parliamentary committee, describes visiting homes where mothers neglect their children to pursue pharmaceutical phantasms, where wives abandon domestic duties to chase opium dreams, where daughters of good families descend into behaviours that would shame the lowest classes. His testimony ignites public outrage not just about addiction itself, but about how the drug has corrupted what society viewed as naturally pure feminine nature. The religious community joins the moral crusade with particular fervour, viewing laudanum addiction as evidence of spiritual weakness that requires both medical and ecclesiastical intervention. Reverend Dr. William Matthews, speaking from the pulpit of St. Paul's Cathedral, denounces the foreign poison that transforms Christian wives into pagan priestesses, seeking artificial visions instead of finding comfort in prayer and scripture. His sermons reflect the widespread belief that opium addiction represents not just medical illness, but moral corruption that threatens the spiritual foundation of Victorian family life. The women's temperance movement, led by figures like Frances Willard, makes laudanum addiction a central focus of their campaigns against intoxicating substances. However, their approach reveals the complex gender dynamics surrounding addiction, as they simultaneously condemn opium use while portraying addicted women as victims of male medical authority rather than moral agents responsible for their own choices. This framework allows society to maintain beliefs about feminine purity while acknowledging the reality of widespread female drug dependency. You observe the parliamentary hearings where testimonies reveal the staggering scope of the laudanum crisis. Dr. Edmund Hartwell presents statistics showing that admissions to private asylums for opium-induced insanity have increased by 400% over the past decade. With women comprising 85% of these cases, his data suggests that thousands of middle and upper-class families are struggling with addicted female members. Though shame and social stigma prevent accurate counting of the true epidemic scale, the medical establishment finds itself in the uncomfortable position of defending practices that have created widespread addiction, while simultaneously acknowledging the need for reform. Dr. Reginald Pemberton, testifying before the Royal College of Physicians Investigative Committee, maintains that properly administered opiate therapy remains essential for treating feminine constitutional disorders. While admitting that certain patients may develop unhealthy dependence requiring modified treatment approaches, his carefully worded testimony reflects the profession's attempt to maintain authority while acknowledging systematic failures. The emerging reform movement includes both progressive physicians who recognize addiction as a medical condition requiring specialized treatment and social activists who view the crisis as evidence of broader problems in how society treats women's health and autonomy. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, one of the few female physicians practicing in Britain, argues that the epidemic of laudanum dependency among women reflects the medical profession's fundamental misunderstanding of feminine psychology and the tendency to medicalize normal, emotional responses to restrictive social conditions. Public sentiment becomes increasingly hostile toward the pharmaceutical industry that profits from addiction. Parliamentary investigators reveal that companies like Burroughs Wellcome have earned enormous profits from laudanum sales while remaining willfully ignorant about dependency risks. The hearings expose marketing practices that explicitly targeted female customers with promises of relief from domestic stress, social anxiety, and the natural weaknesses of feminine constitution. The press coverage of the moral panic reflects Victorian society's complex attitudes toward female addiction, combining genuine concern for suffering women with sensationalized descriptions that titillate readers while maintaining moral superiority. The Illustrated London News publishes dramatic engravings showing the laudanum fiend as a wild-eyed woman attacking her own children, while the Lady magazine offers more sympathetic portrayals of addiction as a medical tragedy requiring compassionate treatment rather than moral condemnation. The international dimension of the laudanum crisis creates additional political complications, as reformers confront the reality that British imperial policy in China and India directly enables domestic addiction problems. Anti-opium activists like Joseph Rowntree argue that a nation that forces opium upon Chinese populations while allowing the same drug to devastate British families demonstrates moral bankruptcy that undermines our claims to Christian civilization. This connection between imperial drug dealing and domestic addiction provides powerful ammunition for reform movements. The legal system struggles to address crimes committed by laudanum-addicted women, creating precedents that will influence addiction jurisprudence for decades. The case of Mrs. Helena Fitzgerald, who killed her housemaid during a laudanum-induced delusional episode, forces courts to consider whether drug intoxication constitutes temporary insanity or criminal responsibility. The verdict, guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, with sentencing to medical treatment rather than prison, establishes legal recognition of addiction as a mitigating factor in criminal behaviour. Social reform organisations begin developing institutional responses to the addiction crisis, establishing private treatment facilities that attempt to provide alternatives to traditional asylum care. The Bethany Home for Afflicted Ladies, founded by Quaker philanthropists, offers what they call moral treatment, combining gradual opium reduction with religious instruction and domestic occupational therapy. These early treatment centres reflect Victorian beliefs that addiction stems from spiritual weakness requiring both medical and moral intervention. The feminist implications of the laudanum crisis become increasingly apparent as reformers recognise connections between women's limited social roles and their vulnerability to pharmaceutical dependency. Mary Wollstonecraft's writings gain new relevance as activists argue that expanding women's educational and professional opportunities would reduce their reliance on drugs for managing the psychological effects of restricted lives. However, most reformers stop short of advocating fundamental changes in gender roles, preferring to focus on medical and moral solutions. Historians still argue whether the Victorian moral panic over female laudanum addiction reflected genuine concern for women's welfare, or served primarily to reinforce social control by pathologizing female behavior that challenged traditional domestic roles. But the evidence suggests complex motivations that included both humanitarian impulses and efforts to maintain existing power structures through medical, rather than legal means. The parliamentary debates reveal deep class anxieties underlying concerns about laudanum addiction, as politicians express particular alarm that the drug has corrupted respectable women rather than limiting its effects to lower classes traditionally associated with vice and dissolution. Lord Ashworth's comment that the sight of a lady of quality reduced to the condition of a common drunkard challenges our fundamental assumptions about the nature of refined femininity, captures the existential threat that middle-class female addiction poses to Victorian social hierarchies. As the moral panic reaches its peak, you witness the beginning of systematic efforts to regulate opium sales, treat addicted individuals, and prevent future epidemics through education and legal restrictions. However, the reforms emerge from a medical and social establishment that created the crisis, ensuring that solutions will reflect the same assumptions about gender, class, and pharmaceutical authority that enabled widespread addiction to develop in the first place. You're sitting in the lecture hall at Guy's Hospital Medical School, where a new generation of physicians is learning to view laudanum addiction not as moral failing, but as genuine medical condition requiring scientific understanding rather than judgmental condemnation. Dr. Thomas Albert, one of Britain's most progressive medical minds, stands before rows of attentive students, describing addiction as a disease of the nervous system that demands the same systematic approach we apply to tuberculosis or typhoid fever. His words represent a revolutionary shift in medical thinking that will slowly transform how society approaches pharmaceutical dependency. The medical community's awakening to addiction's true nature emerges from accumulated clinical observations that can no longer be ignored or explained away through Victorian assumptions about feminine weakness. Dr. Edmund Clouston, publishing in the British Medical Journal, presents case studies documenting the physiological changes that occur during opium dependency, tolerance requiring increased doses, withdrawal symptoms that appear consistently across different patient populations, and the cyclical pattern of craving and relief that characterizes addictive behavior regardless of the patient's moral character or social standing. Doctor. All but demonstrates the new understanding by presenting the case of Mrs. Margaret Thornton, a clergyman's wife whose laudanum addiction began with legitimate medical treatment for chronic pain but evolved into complete physical dependency. Observe how her symptoms follow predictable patterns, he explains to his students. The tremors, perspiration, and agitation that appear at regular intervals, relieved consistently by opium administration. This is not moral weakness. This is neurological adaptation to a powerful pharmaceutical substance. The progressive medical approach requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the profession's role in creating widespread addiction. Dr. Norman Kerr, founding the Society for the Study of Inebriety, forces his colleagues to confront their collective responsibility for the laudanum crisis. We have prescribed with confidence what we should have administered with caution, he admits in his groundbreaking lecture series. Our ignorance of addiction mechanisms does not excuse the suffering we have inadvertently inflicted upon thousands of patients who trusted our medical judgment. You observe Dr. Kerr's innovative treatment methods at his private clinic in Norwood, where he attempts systematic approaches to opium, withdrawal that prioritize patient comfort, and medical supervision over moral condemnation. His graduated reduction protocol slowly decreases patients' daily laudanum doses while providing supportive care for withdrawal symptoms, representing the first scientific attempt to manage addiction as a medical condition, rather than character defect requiring punishment or spiritual correction. The clinical observations emerging from these progressive treatment centres reveal addiction's complexity in ways that challenge Victorian assumptions about willpower and moral responsibility. Dr. Kerr documents cases like Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, who demonstrates perfect rational thinking and moral reasoning while simultaneously experiencing irresistible physical cravings for laudanum. The patient's intellectual faculties remain intact, he notes. Yet her neurological system has been fundamentally altered by prolonged opiate exposure in ways that overwhelm conscious control mechanisms. The new medical understanding faces fierce resistance from conservative physicians who have built their careers on traditional approaches to treating feminine disorders. Dr. Reginald Pemberton publishes articles defending established laudanum prescribing practices, arguing that addiction theories represent dangerous medical radicalism that will deprive suffering women of effective treatment for legitimate constitutional disorders. The professional conflict reflects broader tensions between scientific progress and established medical authority. The treatment innovations you witness at Dr. Kerr's clinic include the first systematic use of substitute medications to ease withdrawal symptoms. He experiments with chloral hydrate and bromide preparations to manage anxiety and insomnia during opium reduction, while employing hydrotherapy and electrical treatments that contemporary medicine believes can restore normal nervous system function. Though many of his methods prove ineffective by modern standards, they represent genuine attempts to develop evidence-based addiction treatment. The psychological aspects of addiction receive increasing attention from alienists like Dr. Henry Maudsley, who recognizes that dependency involves mental as well as physical components. His work with female laudanum addicts reveals that many patients use opium not just to avoid withdrawal symptoms, but to manage underlying depression, anxiety, and trauma that were never properly addressed by their original medical treatment. This insight leads to early recognition that effective addiction treatment must address psychological as well as physiological aspects of dependency. Doctor. Maudsley's case studies document the particular challenges facing women whose addiction began as prescribed medical treatment. Mrs. Helena Fitzgerald's recovery, he observes, requires not just physical withdrawal from laudanum but psychological adjustment to managing emotions and stress without pharmaceutical assistance. The patient must relearn emotional regulation skills that were never developed due to early reliance on opiate medication. He notes, anticipating modern understanding of addiction as learned behavior requiring behavioral as well as medical intervention. The emerging specialty of addiction medicine attracts physicians who recognize career opportunities in addressing a growing social problem while also demonstrating genuine commitment to helping suffering patients. Doctor. Oscar Jennings establishes Britain's first dedicated addiction treatment facility, combining medical detoxification with occupational therapy and family counselling that attempts to address the social factors contributing to substance dependency. The treatment approaches developed by these progressive physicians reflect contemporary understanding of nervous system function, while incorporating innovations that anticipate modern addiction medicine. Doctor. Jennings documents the importance of graduated dose reduction, environmental control during withdrawal, nutritional support for patients whose health has been compromised by chronic drug use, and long-term follow-up care to prevent relapse. His protocols represent the first systematic approach to addiction treatment based on clinical observation rather than moral theory. The research emerging from these early addiction specialists begins documenting the physiological mechanisms underlying opium dependency. Though their understanding remains limited by contemporary scientific knowledge, Dr. Clouston's experiments with laboratory animals reveal that repeated opium administration creates measurable changes in nervous system function, providing objective evidence that addiction involves genuine biological alterations rather than simple moral weakness or lack of willpower. The institutional innovations include establishing specialized nursing care for addiction patients, recognizing that withdrawal management requires medical expertise beyond what general hospital staff can provide. The Bethany Treatment Home trains nurses specifically in addiction care, teaching them to recognize withdrawal symptoms, provide appropriate supportive care, and maintain therapeutic relationships with patients whose behavior may be unpredictable during recovery. You witness family counseling sessions where Dr. Kerr helps husbands and children understand addiction as medical illness rather than moral failure. Charles Whitmore learns that his wife's erratic behavior results from neurological changes caused by prolonged laudanum use rather than personal rejection of her family responsibilities. This understanding transforms his approach from anger and shame to support for her recovery efforts, demonstrating how medical education can facilitate family healing. The progressive physicians also recognize the importance of addressing underlying conditions that initially led to laudanum prescriptions. Dr. Jennings develops treatment protocols that combine addiction recovery with management of chronic pain, depression, and anxiety through methods that don't create pharmaceutical dependency. His holistic approach anticipates modern understanding that effective addiction treatment must address the medical and psychological issues that contribute to substance use. Historians still argue whether these early addiction specialists were genuinely ahead of their time in understanding dependency or simply adapting to social pressure for medical solutions to a crisis their profession had created. But the evidence suggests that many were sincerely committed to developing more effective and humane approaches to treating pharmaceutical dependency. The medical community's slow evolution towards scientific understanding of addiction represents a crucial turning point in how Victorian society approaches drug dependency, mental illness, and women's healthcare. As you observe these pioneering physicians struggling to understand and treat laudanum addiction, you witness the birth of modern addiction medicine emerging from the collision between scientific observation and social crisis, laying groundwork for treatment approaches that will eventually help millions of people recover from pharmaceutical dependency. You're standing in the galleries of Parliament as members debate the Pharmacy Act of 1868, Britain's first serious attempt to regulate the opium trade that has created an epidemic of addiction among the nation's most respectable women. The air crackles with political tension as reformers clash with free trade advocates. Medical professionals defend their prescribing privileges, and pharmaceutical companies lobby against restrictions that threaten their most profitable product lines. What you're witnessing represents the birth of modern drug regulation, emerging from the collision between public health crisis and entrenched commercial interests. The legislative battle reflects deep philosophical divisions about the government's role in protecting citizens from themselves versus preserving individual liberty and commercial freedom. Lord John Russell, speaking for the Reform faction, argues that the state has both the right and duty to prevent the wholesale poisoning of our wives and daughters by substances masquerading as legitimate medicine. His opponents counter that such regulation represents dangerous government intrusion into private medical decisions and commercial relationships that have traditionally remained beyond political interference. The women's rights movement, led by activists like Frances Power Cobb, seizes upon the laudanum crisis to advance broader arguments about female autonomy and medical authority. Speaking at a packed meeting in Exeter Hall, Cobb declares that women have been treated as experimental subjects by a medical profession that prescribes powerful drugs without obtaining genuine informed consent or providing adequate warnings about dependency risks. Her arguments connect pharmaceutical regulation to broader questions about women's legal status and decision-making capacity. The Married Women's Property Act campaign gains momentum from evidence that laudanum-addicted wives have bankrupted families through uncontrolled drug purchases, leading reformers to argue that women need greater legal control over household finances to protect their families from the consequences of medical addiction. Josephine Butler's speeches draw explicit connections between pharmaceutical dependency and women's broader legal powerlessness, arguing that ladies who cannot legally control their own property become easy victims of medical exploitation. You observe the parliamentary hearings where reformers present devastating testimony about the scope of laudanum addiction among British women. Dr. Thomas Clouston's statistical analysis suggests that over 60,000 women across Britain suffer from some degree of laudanum dependency, with the problem concentrated among middle and upper classes who have greatest access to private medical care and pharmaceutical supplies. His numbers shock politicians who had assumed addiction primarily affected lower social classes. The international dimension of reform efforts becomes apparent as activists draw connections between domestic addiction and imperial opium policy. The Anti-Opium Society, founded by Quaker businessman Joseph Rowntree, argues that Britain cannot maintain moral authority in forcing opium upon Chinese populations while allowing the same substance to devastate British families. This argument proves particularly powerful with evangelical Christians who support both foreign missions and domestic moral reform. The pharmaceutical industry's resistance to regulation reveals the enormous profits at stake in the laudanum trade. Representatives from major companies like Burroughs Wellcome testify that proposed restrictions would eliminate legitimate medical treatments while failing to address the underlying causes of addiction. Their arguments emphasize personal responsibility and medical authority while downplaying evidence about the inherently addictive properties of opium-based preparations. The medical profession splits between progressive physicians who support regulation and conservative doctors who view restrictions as government interference with professional judgment. The British Medical Association's official position carefully balances acknowledgement of addiction problems with defence of prescribing autonomy, reflecting the profession's internal conflicts about accepting responsibility for the crisis while maintaining professional authority. Legal reform efforts extend beyond pharmaceutical regulation to address the criminal justice system's treatment of addiction-related crimes. The case of Mrs. Catherine Mills, who murdered her husband during a laudanum withdrawal episode, forces courts to develop new legal frameworks for evaluating criminal responsibility among drug-dependent defendants. The resulting precedents recognise addiction as a mitigating factor while maintaining accountability for criminal behaviour. The establishment of specialised treatment institutions represents another dimension of reform, as philanthropists and medical professionals collaborate to create alternatives to traditional asylum care for addicted women. The National Temperance Hospital opens Britain's first dedicated addiction treatment ward, combining medical detoxification with moral instruction designed to address what reformers view as both physiological and spiritual aspects of dependency. You witness the grassroots organising that emerges as families affected by laudanum addiction begin sharing their experiences and advocating for systematic changes. The Society for the Rescue of Women and Children from the Opium Habit brings together physicians, clergy, and affected families to promote education about addiction risks while providing support for families struggling with addicted members. These organisations represent early recognition that addiction affects entire family systems rather than just individual users. The educational campaign associated with reform efforts produces the first systematic public information about opium addiction, including pamphlets distributed through churches, schools, and women's organisations. The Hidden Danger in Your Medicine Cabinet becomes one of the most widely distributed public health publications of the Victorian era, warning families about the addiction potential of commonly prescribed laudanum while providing guidance for recognising dependency symptoms. The temperance movement's involvement in anti-opium campaigns creates complex alliances between groups that might otherwise have conflicting interests. The Women's Christian Temperance Union broadens its focus from alcohol to include pharmaceutical substances, while traditional temperance advocates find themselves working alongside medical professionals and women's rights activists who share concerns about drug-related social problems despite disagreeing about other issues. The regulatory framework emerging from these reform efforts establishes important precedents for government oversight of pharmaceutical safety and efficacy. The Pharmacy Act requires that laudanum and other opium preparations be sold only by licensed chemists with proper labelling indicating contents and potential dangers. Though these provisions contain significant loopholes, they represent the first systematic attempt to protect consumers from dangerous pharmaceutical products. The enforcement challenges immediately apparent after the Act's passage reveal the difficulties of regulating established addiction markets. Licensed chemists find ways to circumvent restrictions through creative labelling and alternative formulations, while underground suppliers continue serving customers whose needs exceed legal limits. The persistence of illegal markets demonstrates how regulatory approaches must address both supply and demand aspects of addiction problems. The international influence of British reform efforts extends to other countries facing similar opium addiction crises. American physicians and politicians study British regulatory approaches while developing their own responses to pharmaceutical dependency problems. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 will eventually establish more comprehensive federal control over opium products. Building upon precedents established by Victorian-era British reforms, historians still argue whether these early drug regulation efforts were primarily motivated by genuine public health concerns or represented broader social control mechanisms designed to reinforce traditional gender roles and class hierarchies. But the evidence suggests complex motivations that included both humanitarian impulses and desires to maintain social order through legal, rather than purely medical means. The women's rights implications of laudanum reform create lasting precedents for female political organising around health and safety issues. The campaign against pharmaceutical addiction provides a socially acceptable framework for women to engage in public political activity while advocating for greater legal rights and medical autonomy. These organising experiences prove valuable preparation for later suffrage campaigns and broader feminist political engagement. As you observe these reform battles, you witness the birth of modern approaches to drug policy that attempt to balance public health protection with individual liberty, medical authority with government oversight, and commercial interests with social welfare. The solutions emerging from Victorian laudanum reform efforts will influence addiction policy for generations, establishing frameworks for understanding pharmaceutical dependency as both medical condition and social problem requiring coordinated legal, medical and educational responses. You're walking through the transformed landscape of British medicine in the 1880s, where the laudanum crisis has finally begun to recede like a retreating tide, leaving behind changed attitudes toward pharmaceutical prescribing, women's health care, and the very nature of medical authority. The amber bottles that once crowded every respectable medicine cabinet are being replaced by newer preparations, aspirin, developed by Bayer in Germany, and various synthetic compounds that promise pain relief without the devastating dependency that destroyed so many Victorian families. Dr. Felix Hoffmann's synthesis of aspirin in 1897 represents a pivotal moment in pharmaceutical history, offering physicians their first genuinely effective alternative to opium-based pain medications. You observe Dr. Thomas Allbutt demonstrating the new medicine to his colleagues at Guy's Hospital, explaining how salicylic acid derivatives provide analgesic effects without creating the tolerance and dependency that made laudanum so dangerous. "We can now treat pain," he announces to the gathered physicians, without creating patients who become more attached to their medicine than to their recovery. The medical profession's approach to prescribing has been fundamentally transformed by the laudanum disaster. Young physicians trained in the 1880s learned detailed protocols for assessing addiction risk, monitoring patients for dependency symptoms, and prescribing potentially habit-forming substances only when absolutely necessary. Dr. Norman Kerr's textbook Inebriety, Its Etiology, Pathology, Treatment and Jurisprudence becomes required reading in medical schools, ensuring that future doctors understand addiction as a genuine medical condition rather than moral weakness. The social attitudes toward women's health complaints have evolved in response to the recognition that many feminine disorders were actually symptoms of laudanum withdrawal or dependency. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, now practicing openly as one of Britain's first female physicians, observes that women previously diagnosed with hysteria, neurasthenia, and various nervous complaints often recover completely when removed from opiate medication and provided with appropriate psychological support and practical solutions to their life circumstances. You witness the emergence of new treatment modalities that address the underlying causes of the conditions that originally led to laudanum prescriptions. The nascent field of psychology, influenced by French physicians like Jean-Martin Charcot, begins developing talk therapies that help women process trauma, grief, and anxiety without pharmaceutical assistance. These early psychological interventions recognize that many women turn to laudanum not just for physical pain but for emotional distress, that Victorian society provided no other means of addressing. The alternative medicine movement gains credibility as patients seek non-pharmaceutical approaches to managing chronic conditions. Hydrotherapy establishments like those at Malvern and Bath expand their services to include specialised programs for former laudanum users, combining water treatments with exercise, diet modification, and what early practitioners call moral therapy, structured activities designed to rebuild patients' confidence in their ability to manage discomfort without chemical assistance. The pharmaceutical industry itself undergoes significant changes as companies adapt to new regulatory requirements and changing consumer attitudes. Burroughs Wellcome, once one of Britain's largest laudanum producers, transitions towards manufacturing the new synthetic medications while developing more stringent internal protocols for testing addiction potential. Company founder Henry Wellcome publicly acknowledges that the pharmaceutical industry bears responsibility for ensuring that our products heal rather than harm, and we must never again allow commercial interest to override patient safety. The regulatory framework continues evolving as authorities learn from the limitations of the original Pharmacy Act. The Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875 requires accurate labelling of pharmaceutical contents, making it impossible for manufacturers to disguise opium preparations with misleading names like soothing syrups or ladies' tonics. The Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 will eventually establish comprehensive controls over opium and its derivatives, building upon the regulatory foundation laid during the Victorian laudanum crisis. You observe the transformation in medical education, where students now receive extensive training in recognizing and treating addiction. The curriculum includes detailed study of withdrawal management, patient counseling techniques, and the social factors that contribute to pharmaceutical dependency. This educational reform ensures that future physicians understand addiction as a complex medical condition, requiring specialized knowledge rather than simply moral judgment. The women's rights movement continues using the laudanum crisis as evidence for broader arguments about female autonomy and medical decision-making. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 give women greater legal control over their finances, partly motivated by recognition that financial autonomy helps protect families from the economic devastation that often accompanies addiction. Reformers argue that women who control their own resources are less vulnerable to exploitation by unscrupulous physicians or pharmaceutical suppliers. The international influence of British addiction reform spreads to other countries grappling with similar opium problems. American physicians studying at British medical schools return home with new understanding of addiction treatment, while British medical texts on dependency become standard references worldwide. The international opium conferences of the early 1900s will build upon British experiences in developing global approaches to controlling dangerous drugs. The literary and cultural impact of the laudanum crisis continues reverberating through Victorian society as writers, artists, and social commentators process the implications of widespread pharmaceutical addiction among respectable women. The novels of George Eliot and Elizabeth Gaskell begin featuring more nuanced portrayals of women struggling with medical dependency, helping shift public understanding from moral condemnation to sympathetic recognition of addiction as genuine illness. The treatment institutions established during the reform period evolve into permanent fixtures of the healthcare landscape. The Bethany Treatment Home expands its services to include outpatient counseling and family support programs, recognizing that addiction recovery requires ongoing support rather than simply detoxification. These early addiction treatment centers establish precedents for specialized care that will influence substance abuse treatment for generations. The medical profession's relationship with the pharmaceutical industry undergoes fundamental changes as physicians develop greater skepticism about commercial claims regarding new medications. Professional journals begin requiring evidence of safety and efficacy before endorsing pharmaceutical products, while medical societies establish ethics committees to review relationships between physicians and drug manufacturers. These reforms reflect hard-learned lessons about the dangers of uncritical acceptance of pharmaceutical marketing. You witness the emergence of patient advocacy organizations formed by families affected by the laudanum crisis. The National Association for the Prevention of Drug Addiction brings together physicians, former patients, and concerned families to promote education about dependency risks while supporting research into addiction treatment. These organizations represent early recognition that addiction affects entire communities rather than just individual users. The economic impact of reduced laudanum consumption becomes apparent as legitimate pharmaceutical companies report declining profits while investing in research and development of safer medications. The transition proves challenging for some firms, but companies that successfully adapt to the new regulatory environment often emerge stronger and more innovative. The economic disruption demonstrates how public health reforms can drive pharmaceutical innovation by creating market demands for safer products. Historians still argue whether the decline in laudanum addiction primarily resulted from regulatory reforms, medical education improvements, or broader social changes in attitudes toward women's autonomy and healthcare. But the evidence suggests that multiple factors combined to create systematic change that prevented future epidemics of pharmaceutical dependency. As you observe this transformed medical landscape, you realise that the Victorian laudanum crisis served as a painful but necessary education for British society about the dangers of uncritical faith in pharmaceutical solutions to complex human problems. The lessons learned from thousands of women suffering created frameworks for understanding addiction, regulating dangerous substances, and protecting vulnerable patients that continue influencing medical practice and drug policy today. You're standing in a modern medical museum, examining a display case filled with those familiar amber bottles that once promised relief but delivered addiction to countless Victorian women. The placard beside the exhibit reads Laudanum, Lessons from Britain's First Pharmaceutical Crisis, 1830 to 1890. And as you study the artefacts, prescription bottles, medical journals, asylum records, and faded photographs of treatment facilities, you realise that this forgotten epidemic continues shaping how we understand addiction, medical ethics, and the complex relationship between pharmaceutical innovation and patient safety. The legacy of the Victorian laudanum crisis resonates through modern addiction medicine in ways that most people never recognise. Dr. William Osler's principles of medical education developed in response to the professional failures that enabled widespread opium dependency, established the foundation for evidence-based prescribing that remains central to medical training today. His insistence that physicians must understand both the benefits and risks of every medication they prescribe emerged directly from the recognition that well-meaning doctors had created an epidemic through ignorance and overconfidence. The regulatory frameworks born from Victorian opium reform continue influencing contemporary drug policy across the developed world. The Controlled Substances Act in the United States, the Misuse of Drugs Act in Britain, and similar legislation worldwide trace their philosophical foundations to the recognition that some pharmaceutical substances require special oversight to prevent widespread dependency. The scheduling systems that classify medications by abuse potential reflect hard-won Victorian understanding that therapeutic value must be balanced against addiction risk. You observe how the modern opioid crisis eerily mirrors the patterns established during the laudanum epidemic, with prescription painkillers creating widespread addiction among populations who never intended to become drug-dependent. The pharmaceutical marketing tactics that promoted OxyContin and similar opioids echo the Victorian-era promotion of laudanum as safe, effective treatment for various ailments. The social demographics of contemporary prescription opioid addiction, primarily affecting middle-class white populations, replicate the class patterns that characterized Victorian laudanum dependency. The gender dimensions of the laudanum crisis continue influencing how medical professionals approach women's pain and mental health concerns. The historical tendency to dismiss women's physical complaints as hysteria, requiring pharmaceutical management, has evolved into contemporary patterns where women receive more psychiatric medications and pain prescriptions than men with similar symptoms. The Victorian legacy of medicalizing female emotional distress persists in modern prescribing patterns that often prioritize pharmaceutical intervention over addressing underlying social and psychological causes of women's suffering. The treatment approaches pioneered during the Victorian laudanum crisis laid groundwork for modern addiction medicine and rehabilitation. Dr. Norman Kerr's emphasis on gradual dose reduction, rather than immediate cessation, remains the standard approach for managing withdrawal from physically addictive substances. His recognition that addiction involves both physiological dependency and psychological factors anticipated the biopsychosocial model that guides contemporary addiction treatment. The residential treatment facilities he established provided the template for modern rehabilitation centres that combine medical detoxification with behavioural therapy and social support. The pharmaceutical industry's evolution in response to the laudanum crisis established precedents for drug development, testing and marketing that continue shaping how new medications reach the market. The Victorian recognition that pharmaceutical companies must accept responsibility for their product safety led to regulations requiring clinical trials, adverse effect monitoring, and accurate labelling of medication risks. However, the ongoing tension between commercial interests and public health protection reflects unresolved conflicts that emerged during the original opium crisis. The medical profession's collective memory of the laudanum disaster influences contemporary approaches to prescribing potentially addictive medications. The development of prescription monitoring programs, requirements for addiction training in medical education, and clinical guidelines for opioid prescribing all reflect lessons learned from Victorian physicians' experiences with widespread iatrogenic addiction. The professional emphasis on first do no harm gained new meaning after thousands of well-intentioned doctors learned that they had inadvertently created the suffering they sought to alleviate. You examine historical documents revealing how the laudanum crisis influenced early developments in women's healthcare and the feminist movement. The recognition that many women used opium to cope with restrictive social conditions contributed to arguments for expanding women's educational and professional opportunities. Victorian reformers who connected pharmaceutical dependency to women's limited social roles anticipated modern understanding of how social determinants affect health outcomes and addiction vulnerability. The international legacy of British laudanum reform extends to contemporary global efforts to balance legitimate medical access to controlled substances with preventing diversion and abuse. The opium conventions of the early 20th century, which established international cooperation in drug control, built upon British experiences with domestic regulation of pharmaceutical opioids. Modern international drug policy continues grappling with the same fundamental challenge that Victorian reformers faced, ensuring medical access to effective treatments while preventing widespread addiction. The stigma and shame associated with laudanum addiction among Victorian women established patterns of secrecy and denial that continue characterizing prescription drug dependency today. The social isolation experienced by addicted Victorian ladies mirrors the hidden nature of contemporary prescription drug abuse, particularly among middle-class populations who fear social consequences of acknowledging dependency. The Victorian emphasis on maintaining respectability while struggling with addiction created cultural templates for concealing pharmaceutical dependency that persist in modern society. The early recognition that addiction affects entire families, not just individual users, emerged from Victorian experiences with laudanum-dependent mothers and wives. The family therapy approaches developed during the Reform period anticipated modern understanding of addiction as a family system disorder, requiring comprehensive treatment that addresses relationship dynamics, communication patterns, and codependency issues. The Victorian recognition that children of addicted parents face special vulnerabilities laid groundwork for contemporary research on intergenerational transmission of addiction risk. Historians still argue whether the Victorian laudanum crisis represents a unique historical phenomenon or reflects recurring patterns in how societies respond to pharmaceutical innovation. But the evidence suggests that the basic dynamics, initial medical enthusiasm, gradual recognition of addiction problems, social panic, and eventual reform, repeat whenever powerful psychoactive substances become widely available for medical use. The literary and cultural legacy of the laudanum crisis continues influencing how addiction is portrayed in popular media and literature. The Victorian archetype of the refined lady secretly struggling with pharmaceutical dependency appears in contemporary novels. Films and television shows that explore prescription drug abuse among seemingly successful individuals. The tragic figure of the talented writer or artist whose creativity becomes intertwined with substance use traces back to Victorian experiences with laudanum-dependent literary figures. The economic lessons learned from the laudanum crisis continue relevant to contemporary healthcare policy discussions about pharmaceutical costs, insurance coverage for addiction treatment, and the economic burden of prescription drug abuse. Victorian recognition that addiction creates substantial social costs, including family financial destruction, lost productivity, and healthcare expenses, anticipated modern economic analyses of substance abuse impact on society. As you conclude your examination of this museum exhibit, you realise that the Victorian laudanum crisis represents more than historical curiosity. It provides a template for understanding how pharmaceutical innovation can create unintended consequences that reshape entire societies. The amber bottles in the display case serve as silent witnesses to thousands of women whose suffering taught crucial lessons about the complex relationship between medicine, addiction, and social responsibility. The ultimate legacy of the Victorian laudanum epidemic lies not in the specific details of 19th century opium use, but in the broader understanding that pharmaceutical power requires careful stewardship, that addiction represents genuine medical illness requiring compassionate treatment, and that society bears collective responsibility for protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation by those who profit from their dependency. These lessons, written in the suffering of countless Victorian women, continue guiding efforts to balance pharmaceutical innovation with public health protection, ensuring that future generations can benefit from medical advances without repeating the tragic mistakes that turn medicine into a source of widespread addiction and social disruption. As you step away from the museum exhibit and walk slowly toward the exit, your footsteps echoing softly in the quiet halls, you feel the weight of history settling gently around your shoulders like a familiar shawl. The amber bottles behind the glass have revealed their secrets, and the women whose lives they touched, Mrs. Catherine Whitmore with her desperate midnight wanderings, Lady Pembroke floating through drawing rooms in opium-induced serenity, Elizabeth Barrett Browning finding both inspiration and imprisonment in her daily doses, begin to fade from vivid presence into gentle memory. The gas lamps of Victorian London dim in your mind's eye, replaced by the soft glow of modern lighting that guides you toward rest. The screams from Bedlam's corridors grow quiet. The frantic discussions in Parliament's chambers become distant whispers, and the clicking of heels on cobblestone streets transforms into the rhythm of your own peaceful breathing. Doctor, Pemberton's confident prescriptions, the underground chemists with their concentrated preparations, the reform movements and medical revelations, all of these urgent concerns settle into the past where they belong. Their lessons learned and their stories told. You feel yourself drifting between centuries now, as the Victorian women who suffered through laudanum's promises and betrayals take their final bows and step quietly into history's embrace. Their pain has been witnessed, their experiences honoured, their lessons preserved for future generations who might face similar challenges with different substances, but the same human vulnerabilities. The amber liquid that once seemed to hold all the answers has revealed its true nature not as salvation but as teacher, showing us the delicate balance between healing and harm, between medical intervention and human